It's one home, one apartment, one thing. It's one of a kind.
But the rise in social media real estate isn't just about the instant gratification. Researcher Andre Perry, who studies economic inclusion at the Brookings Institute, says social media has evolved from the days of online hangout spaces and mood boards to a powerful change agent.
Social media is a primary source to get news and information, but it's not just about social media, it's about the movement that we're in. The racial justice uprising really gave people a sense of worth and empowerment. And so people not only are getting information about what protects people in the long run from economic shocks, things like wealth.
In his research, Andre found that not only are more millennials buying homes during the pandemic, the rate of home ownership among Black millennials are at historic highs.
The fastest way to accumulate wealth in this country traditionally has been through home ownership. Millennials in particular are saying, hey, I want protection. I want to live longer. I want my education to go further. Let me acquire wealth. And the fastest way to do that is through home ownership. When the pandemic hit, many of the amenities or the comforts that came along with those living conditions were gone. Folks couldn't go to bars and fancy shops. And so you saw, instead of people going out and buying clothes, they saved their money and bought property and outside of the city generally. People are moving to the suburbs, to rural areas, places where home prices are a little bit cheaper.
Many home buyers are looking for houses outside the major metropolitan areas. Additionally, many home buyers are looking for direct outdoor access and added space as the uncertainty about the virus persists.
Millennials are also looking to influencers not just for the latest trends and TikTok dances, but to partake in important conversations, be it about politics or personal finance or anything in between.
Real estate ownership. Let's start small. Let's don't be scared to start small. Instead of renting a big house in the hills in California like most artists do, buy you one that's on the flat.
I meet folks like Brandon Rule and Charlemagne the God.
So you have residential real estate and you have commercial real estate.
They're talking about buying homes. When I was coming up, really home buying was a mysterious, shrouded process that only a few people could teach me. Now I can easily log on to Clubhouse or Instagram and find literally lessons on how to purchase a home, but done with savvy and finesse.
Today we're going to make a greenhouse.
I am DIYing the entire closet.
Heather, having bought her fixer-upper sight unseen, also looked to internet personalities to help figure out how to modernize and to make sure her home was also an investment.
It gave us a lot of confidence. They make it look super easy how we could do all of those things ourselves. My husband just installed a laundry chute, which is something we never would have thought of if we didn't see an influencer do that and how easy it actually is.
Really simple do-it-yourself project. You can do that. If you have any questions, go ahead and message me.
And in the case of Neville House, Josh and Pele hope that buyers see these homes as potential secondary income.
These young families look at these products or look at our homes and say, here's a turnkey Airbnb. This can serve our family, but this can also be the perfect rental. We've tried to strike a balance in the design of the home for, working well as a family home that's going to be lived in and also working as an investment.
A lot of this just points to how millennials can utilize and leverage social media to their benefit. But it also speaks to, again, this moment that folks want freedom. So millennials are really stepping up to this real estate game and taking ownership and building wealth.
Of course, not everything is as it seems online. While social media can be a useful tool for learning, there's still a lot it can't tell you about the home buying experience, or living in the suburbs for that matter.
We knew going into it, budgeting for a lot of renovations. We kind of thought if we buy it at $450,000, we could put $200,000-300,000 into the house and really make it ours and our own.
We can't wait to replace in this kitchen and update our built-in deep fryer, which was not in the listing photos.
We kind of got into the house and we realized that budget was completely unrealistic.
We have a lot of people who see our design on Instagram and they say, I love it, can you come build this on my property? And then they'll send us the lot, which they bought sight unseen during COVID, and because of site conditions or zoning, it's virtually unbuildable.
I think we all know that what you see on Instagram and what you see in real life are two very different things. So while we can definitely, as brokers, create these fantastic narratives, the one recommendation that I would give is do your homework. Don't believe everything you say. That's not to say that, there's dishonesty or anything where people are trying to manipulate you, but not everything you see is accurate.
This shift towards social media house hunting may also help to bring equilibrium to a market that has historically disadvantaged specific groups of buyers.
Many of the traditional ways that people got mortgages or loans often precluded Black people because they deemed us too risky for those loans. With technology, there's ways to get around that. As long as more Black people get educated on racism and discrimination in lending, we're going to figure out ways to get around that racism.
When I was 24 years old, I saw the UFC on a pay-per-view on TV, and I was so overwhelmed by the athleticism, the skill. And then at the end of the fight, the combatants hugged, they shook hands, and I just fell in love with it.
Part of UFC's appeal is it doesn't look like a balletic display of martial talent and mastery as much as it looks like a bar fight.
We choose to do this because we love the sport, but it is a business. And if you do not treat it like a business, I guarantee you that the promoter is, and you will be left broken at the end of your career.
Each of us have an individual story, but as with anything, you take enough of these individual stories and you see not only crossover, but intersectionality.
A group of former UFC fighters that are suing the UFC scored a key legal victory on Thursday when a federal judge said he would grant their lawsuit class action status.
There have been fights in every major U.S. sport about workers' power in the labor market.
I don't think there's a guy in the sport, from the guy who just got his first fight all the way up to the Conor McGregors, that is pleased with the way the UFC treats fighters, the way we've been strong-armed, the way we've been coerced.
Fights over unionization in some sports, fights over free agency in baseball, and in boxing, the Muhammad Ali Act, which restricts the kinds of contract terms that can be imposed on boxers. The fighters who brought this lawsuit see it as the continuation of a tradition in sports, of athletes fighting to have agency and power in the terms of their work and who they do it for. Mixed martial arts used to be pretty culturally and legally fringe in the United States. It was banned by most states. John McCain had famously called it human cockfighting. There are some rules in the UFC, but to a large extent, all sorts of body parts and tactics and attacks are on the table, and people get seriously injured at times.
My nose has been broken multiple times.
I had my right pectoral torn off, had to get that reattached.
I've had my jaw broken in 2 places. I've had my neck broken.
Had my left ankle broken, had to get that repaired.
I've had torn right labrum in my shoulder.
He broke my eyeball, the bone that holds up my eyeball.
I've had my left eye orbital fracture twice where my eye caved in.
I was swallowing my own blood, and I knew, don't blow your nose or both eyes will blow.
At the time that UFC was bought for just $2 million by the former boxing coach, Dana White, and a casino owner he'd been friends with, Lorenzo Fertitta, and his brother Frank Fertitta, UFC was struggling, as were other mixed martial arts promoters. It was pretty much a fixer-upper. The money that they spent to actually purchase it for $2 million was much less than the money they quickly had to sink into it in order to revitalize it. They pulled off a multi-pronged strategy that was quite successful. First, they did what White has referred to as running towards regulation. They found ways to make compromises with state regulators so that the sport would not be illegal. And at the same time, they also popularized it. They made gambles like paying the production costs themselves for the first season of a reality TV show, The Ultimate Fighter, on Spike TV.
It's all over! It is all over! Diego Sanchez is the Ultimate Fighter!
UFC, under Dana White, had a gift for weaving compelling personal narratives and rivalry. People throwing shoes, a guy coming to the octagon with Who Let the Dogs Out playing while he was dragging another guy on a leash.
My first contract with the UFC is kind of an interesting story because here I am on this reality show, The Ultimate Fighter, and they started to realize how big of a stepping stone this was going to be for the UFC. Sat us all down individually, put a contract in front of us and said, hey, we realize that this is going to be huge and we really want to have you all a part of the UFC family moving forward. So we want to go ahead and get this out of the way, just sign this simple contract and we'll be able to move forward as one unit. But as I'm looking at this thick contract and wondering what I should do, Dana White looks at me and says, don't worry, if this thing takes off, we'll take care of you.
The fighters would say, at the heart of UFC's power is the contracts that it signs with fighters.
Before boxing had competition, boxing used to be dominated by a few dominant promoters, and the contracts were ported over from boxing. And the contracts are basically designed to control every aspect of a fighter's career. They're long-term. They last multiple fights.
Fighters under these contracts are bound to fight only for UFC for a period of time, and UFC can extend that time if a fighter declines a match or if a fighter gets injured.
They control who the fighter fights. They control when the fighter fights. And then they have a number of different clauses that make it very difficult for a fighter to ever break free from the UFC if that fighter ever did want to become a free agent.
contracts are so one-sided. There really is no negotiation room for any of the things, especially as you're coming up and as their stranglehold on the sport of MMA got so much stronger.
Part of what's at the heart of this lawsuit is the ways that UFC successfully took other competitors off the board.
The UFC had such a stranglehold on mixed martial arts, and as they were buying up so much of the competition, shutting them all down, they really became the only option for anybody that wanted to do this professionally.
If you follow Dana White's Twitter or watch him on YouTube, you could have seen Dana White calling himself the Grim Reaper and bragging about how he has defeated or derailed or acquired one after another company that tried to compete with the UFC. In 2011, UFC acquired Strikeforce, which at the time was the most prominent rival still standing.
Kung Lee is unbelievable. It was a great fight. Let's hear it for him one more time. Scott Smith and Kung Lee.
The CEO of Strikeforce, Scott Coker, has said in the past that he saw himself like Luke Skywalker up against the Death Star trying to compete with UFC.
Eventually, when Strikeforce was bought out by UFC, my only option was go to UFC because they had the rest of my contract. Now I'm under a contract where it's only an 18-month contract with 6 fights, but 5 years later, I'm still stuck in the contract.
The month before UFC's parent company, Zuffa, completed its acquisition of Strikeforce, a UFC executive sent an email, and the subject line of that email was, "We own MMA."
And the UFC has admitted in documents that have now become public that they've almost never lost a fighter that they wanted to keep.
In internal UFC emails, we now know the company referred to what it was doing as choking off oxygen to the competition. The most important oxygen that UFC allegedly ran afoul of the law by cutting off to its competitors is the fighters themselves.
And not only did they make it clear to us, they made it clear to the whole mixed martial arts world, there is no negotiating.
These are very strict, never-ending contracts, and that's the case to this day. The UFC just says, oh, you want to fight for us, you sign here. If you don't want to, we've got 20 other guys that'll take your spot.
They have 70, 80, 90% of the top fighters under exclusive contract, meaning that those fighters are not available to any other MMA promoter.
And fighters, even if they wiggled their way out of the very restrictive contracts that UFC imposed on them, didn't have another professional mixed martial arts option because there weren't robust rivals to go sell their work to.
On Tuesday afternoon, a class action lawsuit was filed in U.S. District Court in San Jose against Zuffa LLC with fighters Kung Lee, Nate Quarry, and John Fitch attached to the suit.
Rampage Jackson came to me and says, hey, Kung, I know this lawyer. He will help get some fairness for the fighters in the marketplace. And I decided I wanted to step up for all the fighters that's being affected.
At the end of 2014, more than 6 years ago now, a group of now all former fighters filed an antitrust class action lawsuit against UFC.
And in broad terms, the case is an antitrust case where we're claiming that the UFC is both a monopoly and a monopsony.
Usually when we talk about monopoly, we're talking about the power that a company has when it becomes the only one selling something. monopsony is about the power of being a monopoly purchaser of something, and particularly a monopoly purchaser of labor. A key argument in this lawsuit has been about, as UFC succeeds and its revenue soars, how much should we expect that, absent illegal conduct, the fighters' pay would soar as well. In UFC, year after year, the share of the company's revenue that goes to actually paying the workers doing the fighting has hovered around or below 20%.
And what this analysis shows through complex statistical regression modeling is that if the UFC was competitive and did not allegedly violate the antitrust laws, it would pay its fighters 50% or more of the revenues it's generated, just like baseball, just like hockey, just like basketball, boxing. If instead of paying 20% of the revenues generated, it paid 50% or more of the revenues generated, the fighters would have made $1.6 billion more during the period that we measured, 2010 to 2017.
Sometimes when you write about allegations against companies, and particularly about lawsuits against companies, those companies don't want to say a whole lot about them or are pretty dismissive of the significance of litigation against them. UFC, in their comments to me, has been pretty feisty about this, saying that they see this lawsuit actually as a threat to the ability of businesses to take risks and succeed, and that they don't want to roll over, that they want to fight it and they want to defeat it. The fighters I talked to described having side jobs, being reliant on UFC in part because after taxes and expenses, they weren't making enough money to feel financially secure.
The overview of my career from a financial perspective is, something I've had a challenge in admitting. I can tell you now that I lived in my mom's detached garage the entire time I was fighting, and I had a second job as a bouncer and a bartender, a third job as a personal trainer, just to make ends meet.
Nate Quarry told me that over his time in UFC, he fought fights while he was tens of thousands of dollars in debt coming into the fight.
It gets so disheartening because I've seen fights that are called the fight of the year. This is just this brutal war. And they battled for 4.5 rounds until one guy's body just gave up. And then you find out, oh, that guy made $60,000 for that fight.
In one of the hearings in this lawsuit, UFC's attorney argued that if the fighters were really the product, if all that UFC were selling were the fighters, then the fighters wouldn't need UFC at all. That a fighter is not themselves the UFC product any more than an Apple engineer who makes a cool iPhone is the product that Apple is selling.
We, the fighters, make this whole thing happen. And it's been driven by Chuck Liddell. It's been driven by Randy Couture. It's been driven by Conor McGregor. It's been driven by Brock Lesnar. It's been driven by all the greats that have walked before us and that walk this path right now. We are the product.
If the fighters are not the product, then go ahead and release us from our contracts. You'll do fine without us, clearly.
It's the identity and rank and popularity of those fighters that attract the eyeballs and make the sport what it is. And if you can lock all those up and keep them from other promotions, you can dominate the sport, which is what they've admitted they've done.
William Isaacson, a lawyer for UFC, said in a statement that UFC has spent many years building a world-class organization, enhancing the brand of our athletes, and championing the sport of MMA. UFC pays its fighters more than any other MMA promoter, with average fighter compensation rising by over 600% since 2005. Our efforts have raised the global popularity of the sport and the overall revenue potential of all MMA organizations and athletes. In December of 2020, the judge announced a crucial step in this lawsuit, which is that he is going to certify it as a class action. Class certification makes this lawsuit a much more significant threat to UFC. And the judge made clear long before saying how he planned to rule that he expected whatever he did to be appealed into federal appeals court and on from there to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we are likely in for many more months and years of wrangling over this. Kyle Kingsbury said that he doesn't think any settlement would be acceptable unless it includes a change to the restrictive contracts that UFC uses to keep fighters bound to the UFC.
My son's about to turn 6 years old, and it started when he was in the womb. You know, we're in this thing to the end to change the sport forever. We want the same freedoms that are offered in any other major sport, and every other major sport has gone through what we're going through right now.
People tell fighters, just shut up. Look at how lucky you are. Well, no, actually, we're fighting for what we believe in. We're going to continue being fighters. And that's how we're made.
Every nation that's a coastal state has some region of the seafloor that falls within their territorial waters, and many countries, including the U.S., the area that's underwater exceeds the area that's above water. So huge amounts of nations, areas, and regions are just really unexplored, uncharacterized. We don't really know what's there.
We know less about our seabed than we do about the surface of the Moon or Mars. Only 20% of it has been mapped. A map of the seafloor could lead to all kinds of discoveries, like new marine species and rare earth minerals like cobalt that we need for electric cars and mobile phones. The value of all the gold deposits alone on the seafloor is estimated to be around $150 trillion. A map could also help us when tragedy strikes.
Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared from radar screens.
Mapping of the ocean floor is being carried out. Problem is that the southern Indian Ocean is just so incredibly huge.
To me, a map is a fundamental piece of understanding of who we are, where things are. Once you understand something, you start to value it more. And when you start to value something, that's when you start to really think about making it healthy and preserving it and keeping it going. A map is the first step. It's the basic understanding that you need to figure out where you are.
Oceans. They cover over 70% of the planet, but most of what lies underneath is a mystery.
The seafloor is a really fascinating landscape. We don't have a lot of data to describe the shape of it in detail, but in places where we do, there are spectacular features. There's meandering channels with all kinds of interesting topography. There are canyons, there are seamounts, mid-ocean ridges, all kinds of things that we see on land that are just basically hidden from us by the water.
As it stands, this is what a map of the seabed looks like. All that black, those are the parts we haven't mapped yet.
At present, most people think that the seafloor is actually mapped because you'll see a world ocean map and you can see some shape of the seafloor, but most of that is based on prediction. Roughly 80% of what you see for the world ocean floor is modeled based on measurements of the sea surface height and a computation based on gravity.
2017, the Nippon Foundation and the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, or GEBCO, launched Seabed 2030. It's a collaborative project to collect and collate data ocean-wide and create a complete map of the seafloor by the end of the decade. To do this would take one ship around 350 years at a cost of up to $3 billion. That's why data is harvested by all kinds of vessels, from fishing boats to freighters.
Because there is so little data, it's important that vessels that are capable and willing to acquire data when they're just moving around the ocean do so. So we have a lot of data that's collected during transits. There's a lot of academic requirements to make data publicly available. There's industry data that's starting to become more and more available. There's government data. So there's a lot of different ways that this data is coming in, and it's a really messy and challenging puzzle to put together. But what's exciting is that it's a puzzle to put together.
Since Seabed 2030 launched, the area mapped has risen to 20%, and all the information collected is freely available.
The more data we have collectively and other people can access, the faster the discoveries are made, which really pushes forward our understanding at a faster rate than if you held on to that data and it was only you with that data. Things like machine learning and artificial intelligence are also going to kick in the next decade, because with all this data, they'll be able to make connections that a lot faster than perhaps we would have been able to, which then again feeds our human understanding and also gives us new ideas, new ways of thinking, of exploration.
Until the early 20th century, mapping technology was simple, usually a weight attached to a long rope known as a lead line. After the Titanic sank in 1912, explorers proposed using sound waves to find its hull in the North Atlantic. This led to sonar, the most common technique used for mapping today. Operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, the Falkor is an 82-meter-long research vessel, equipped with 2 multi-beam sonar systems that have helped Deborah Smith and a team of other marine technicians to map over 1 million square kilometers of the seafloor.
You know, you go from somebody with a rope with some knots to sonar acoustics that is, I call it math magic, but it is incredibly advanced mathematical technology to be able to measure the distance and time of travel of sound on a moving ship. Multi-beam mapping works by using sonars. So sonar is taking sound and a measurement of time. So you have a multi-beam sonar and it sends out a ping of sound. That sound travels through the water column, hits the seafloor and comes back to the ship, and we measure that time and we're able to calculate the distance. Each individual ping of sound has many, many beams. So it looks like a giant fan across the seafloor, and that fan is moving along the seafloor. So you have many tiny little beams going across, and they're traveling along a track. You can look at that data and look at both the peaks and the valleys and the highs and the lows and sort of create a three-dimensional image of the seafloor. The accuracy of multi-beam sonar really depends on the water depth that you're in. Think of it like a flashlight beam, and if you're holding a flashlight and you're shining it on the floor, the closer you get to the floor with your flashlight, the smaller that beam is. If you have 400 of these beams all across, so think of 400 people holding a flashlight, the closer they hold that flashlight to the seafloor, the smaller your beam is, which also means the smaller that you can find information or data about. So it really depends on the depth of the seafloor in order to see how much you can define an object.
This variation in depth means that mapping resolution will range from 100 by 100 meters in shallow waters to 800 by 800 meters in the deepest parts of the ocean, which go down as far as 11,000 meters. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, can then be sent down to investigate seabed features up close.
We've just crossed the 1,000-metre mark. It's 4.6 degrees C, and now we're going to drive the ROV down at a higher rate towards the sea floor.
On a recent mapping expedition, scientists on the Falkor discovered a 500-metre-tall coral structure in Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the first to be discovered in over 120 years.
A place that is incredibly popular, well-visited, well-traveled, we're still finding new things. You don't know until you map it. And so until you get that sort of high-resolution picture, you don't know the sand waves or the old riverbeds that used to be there or the waterfalls off the side of a volcano that used to be above the surface and now is below the surface. It's a little bit of everything. Think of, let's say, Hawaii or someplace where you see a volcano above the water. Picture that below the water.
I'm really kind of obsessed with the whole concept of scale here. Although we can create 3D models and, kind of come up with these visualizations, it's not the same as that feeling of looking out over this big landscape. But, I think we'll get there soon with VR and other kinds of technology, but it's really spectacular to think about, especially with the familiarity that some of us have with these features, like what it looks like. We look out at the ocean and it just looks flat, maybe with little bumps. We really don't think about all of this that's underneath, and it's really an amazing landscape that's just hidden from us.
With more than 90% of the ocean deeper than 200 meters, fleets of autonomous vehicles could make the data gathering process faster, cheaper, and safer. And new discoveries might help with exploration of all kinds.
I think the ocean can actually provide us with huge insights as we go out into space as well and look for life and other kinds of life forms. I also think in this next few years, we will have a different kind of access to the ocean because of virtual reality and augmented reality. And so that will allow us to sit in our living rooms and really experience what's underwater in a different way and see this different alien planet.
Since the dawn of man, meat has been on the menu.
Then a pure beef hamburger.
Over a pound of meat. We have the meats.
And even with growing trends of vegetarian diets and plant-based substitutes, around 89% of the world population consider themselves omnivores.
We have come a long way from our hunter and gatherer roots. We have managed to establish a whole industry designed to feed almost 7.7 billion people. We've maximized production and we managed to reduce hunger over the past couple of decades.
And although we've become exceedingly efficient at putting meat on the table, raising livestock animals by the billions comes with its own set of consequences.
If animal agriculture continues to expand the way it has, there is a risk that we won't be able to stop climate change.
But with rapid advances in technology, we might soon see a food industry that leaves all those problems behind.
I'm about to be one of the world's first commercial customers for lab-grown meat, cultured meat, to eat just as the company, and I'm very, very excited. Here is the chicken. Looks pretty crispy outside. That's really good. I mean, look, it's really tasty.
Here at 1880 in Singapore, cultured chicken is being served under a regulatory approval granted by the Singaporean government. It's the very first time a cultured meat product, meat made from animal cells grown in a lab, has been approved for commercial sale. Eat Just, the company behind these chicken nugget-style dishes, is based out of San Francisco and got their start in 2011 developing plant-based egg substitutes like mung bean scrambled eggs and mayonnaise. But it wasn't until 2017 that they announced they were shifting focus to a cultured meat product.
In order to feed the world that we live in, a lot of animal protein, we need to take a third today, and it'll be more tomorrow, of our world and make it dedicated to feeding chickens and cows. We go to areas that are filled with biodiverse rainforests, taking a bulldozer to them and planting soy and corn to feed the chickens that we eat. Climate change is accelerated by the kind of animal production that we engage in. When we bring animals in tiny little spaces, that accelerates the probability that more zoonotic diseases are going to impact our families. And from a morality perspective, why do we need to cause any harm to any other living thing to have dinner that tastes good? It does not have to be that way. And those things underlie the force of this idea.
The meat alternatives that have made it to the market thus far have been plant-based. Imitation beef and pork made from ingredients like pea protein and coconut oil by companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. That's a very different proposition from cultured meat, which is made from actual animal cells.
I'm a huge fan of any company, of any person trying to make a product that's improving the food system, including all the plant-based proteins. Maybe in some future menu, you'll have this kind of cultivated chicken, and you'll also have a plant-based version. That's fine. But I guess you have to ask yourself, in our lifetime, is that diner likely to also remove the conventional option on the menu too? We do think we need a more permanent solution. We do think we sort of need, if you will, an end game to this problem. And we just think this is more likely to be the path to achieve that.
So animal cell technology has been around for several decades for applications such as development of vaccines and other biotherapeutics. The first known prototype of cultured meat was done by Mark Post earlier in 2011. And essentially, he was developing a beef patty. It was a very expensive prototype, if I'm not mistaken, above 250,000 euros at the time to produce just one beef patty. But it was more of a proof of concept to really demonstrate that this technology is possible and that it can be done. The way that we grow and produce cultured chicken is essentially we isolate chicken cells from chickens without having to kill them. So from a small biopsy, for instance, we immerse these cells in a liquid broth that contains the nutrients that the cells need to survive and be healthy and to grow. We really need these cells to multiply to reach the numbers that are sufficient to make a meat product. We're looking into the cells that are really important for meat. So we think about muscle cells, fat cells. By that isolation, we are able to form those muscle tissues in culture. The culture happens inside of a fermentation tank, what we call the bioreactor, which is essentially providing the same conditions as the animal body. Warm temperatures, some sort of mechanical stimulation, so that the cells are exposed to very similar conditions that they had inside of the animal. After the cells proliferate and reach a certain density, the final step is essentially to separate those cells from the liquid broth that they are in. We just make sure that the product meets our quality and safety standards, and then those cells are ready for consumption. Milk, cheese, yogurt, a lot of those derive from fermentations. The only difference is that they're starting from a different cell type. In this case, we're just using the animal cells as the initial and beginning of the product.
Eat Just has developed chicken nuggets so far, with far more textured chicken breasts planned for the future. But another cell-based meat startup, Memphis Meats, has already started working on culturing other animal cells as well.
We've done beef, we've done duck, we've done chicken. And these are things that are favorites in various parts of the world. For instance, people in America love beef and chicken. People in China love duck. So we wanted to show that we at Memphis Meats can produce meats that we as a global population love to eat. There's a lot of similarity on how we grow the meats from various animals or fish. but they're also different because of nutrients they need and how they actually come together to form the final product, the meat. And I think it's very similar to how we also grow various animals. There's similarities in the feed that we give cows and pigs and chickens, but there's also differences how we cultivate, and it's very similar for us as well. So we've been working with the FDA and the USDA for the last 3 years and really developing the guidelines on how this food should be regulated when we come to the market. As soon as we get regulatory approval in the United States, people will be able to go to their supermarket and buy it and enjoy it. They'll be able to go to a restaurant near them and order meat directly from animal cells.
But it's not just getting the meat right. Once approved, the gates open to a very high potential demand, and scaling becomes the next big hurdle.
Before, we can only make chicken for myself, my friends, my girlfriend, my family, my colleagues. Now we actually have the ability to make chicken for millions of people. So that allows us to invest and to allow the economies of scale to drop the price. The second is we need to reduce the cost of the nutrients that these cells are consuming. So I think chicken feed raises or drops the price of chicken. The nutrients we feed ourselves does the same thing, so we need to drive that down. The cell density is another technical element. We need to continue to increase that, and hammering on those things over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years will put us in a place where we're significantly below the cost of this animal protein, and that will be one of the main inflection points that will lead to a new way of eating meat.
So here is a close-up of a half-eaten crispy chicken bite. You know what? What I'm really thinking is, I'm eating chicken. I like chicken. You know, the normal chickens I eat, I don't know where they came from. And so I don't know why I should be very stressed where this came from either.
The meat market is worth more than $1 trillion annually, and there are over 60 startups in the cultured meat field.
Cultured meat has attracted several prominent investors, including Sergey Brin, Richard Branson, and Bill Gates. What is also interesting is that even meat giants such as Cargill and Tyson have invested in space. It's this disruptive potential of the market, as well as the promise to greatly reduce the climate impact of meat production that has attracted investors.
It remains to be seen who will get regulatory approval in which countries, and whether consumers will like lab-grown meat enough to make the switch. And while there's no evidence that lab-grown meat is any less healthy than traditional meat, there's an ongoing debate over how healthy eating meat is in general. But if these products are a success, they could be the beginning of a more humane, less destructive meat industry.
The food and ag industry is the most innovative industry in the world. It's always figured out how to feed a growing population, and we've never failed doing so. And it's been very clear to us that we are part of that, and we're going to figure out how to feed the next 3 billion people joining us. And I just see an evolution.
We can do this a bit differently. We can do this in a way that is consistent with the kind of people that we want to be, the kind of planet that we all want to live in. We can build a food system that reflects really the best characteristics of who we are. And that makes me really hopeful.
Impossible Foods might be the world's most ambitious company. Just listen to founder and CEO Pat Brown.
People wonder how big the plant-based meat industry is going to be. It will be the meat industry in 20 years. We're going to look back and basically say, wow, remember back in the day when we used to use animals to make meat?
Yes, Impossible's stated goal really is to replace the use of animals as a food production technology globally by 2035. That would mean supplanting a $1.2 trillion industry, not to mention a source of sustenance as old as time. To be fair, the company has got a lot of people talking about its products.
So there's this thing called the Impossible Burger.
What's called artificial meat. The realest, fakest burger in the world.
Not bad. But before Impossible Foods can take over the world, it's going to have to overcome strong competitors, penetrate tough new markets, and generally transform its product from a conversation piece into a ubiquitous staple food. With the coronavirus turning the world of food upside down, this could be the moment when Impossible's newfangled meat goes mainstream. Impossible Foods was founded in 2011 when Pat Brown, a longtime vegan, was nearing the end of an accomplished career in biochemistry.
I've been a scientist my whole life and just came to this realization that by far the most important scientific question in the world is, what makes meat delicious?
Pat Brown, some would call a zealot for his mission. He really doesn't hold back when it comes to talking about wanting to completely replace animal agriculture.
Producing meat from animals is the most destructive technology on Earth, and if we're going to avert catastrophic climate change, we have to find a better way to produce meat.
You've probably heard about the dangers of cow flatulence. Their digestive systems produce large quantities of the powerful greenhouse gas, methane. In fact, it's estimated that livestock farming is responsible for nearly 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Impossible claims it takes 89% less GHGs, 87% less water, and 96% less land to produce its burger. The key, of course, would be to get people to actually eat the thing, which is where the company's secret ingredient comes in. Heme, a genetically engineered substance with a bloody iron-rich taste like red meat.
So heme is a very controversial part of the Impossible Burger. It's also what makes the Impossible Burger what it is. There are a lot of consumer groups and anti-GMO groups that oppose the Impossible Burger because of the heme. The studies on its safety are pretty short term, but the FDA has approved it and the company says it's completely safe. And there isn't any evidence that it isn't.
Critics have also challenged the company's claim to health advantages over traditional meat, pointing out that while the Impossible Burger has less fat, sodium, and calories than its beefy cousin, it's also more highly processed. But let's be real, we're talking about mimicking hamburgers here, not kale salads.
These burgers are definitely better for the environment, so that's a plus, but they are not necessarily better for your health.
After years in the lab, Pat and his colleagues were confident they had a product even Ron Swanson could love, and the Impossible Burger made its debut in 2016.
Their burger began its life in the public when it was sold at David Shank's Momofuku. And they went from sort of higher-end fine dining restaurants into higher-end burger restaurants like Bear Burger and Umami Burger. And then suddenly they started popping up everywhere.
This tastes like a burger. It tastes like meat.
This is all made from plants.
It's all made from
This
plants.
tastes like beef.
Doesn't that just look like real meat?
So meat-like.
They always say it's just like a burger. It tastes like yuckers.
Beef farmers of the world, relax.
That doesn't taste like a burger.
Opinions differed on the Impossible Burger's relative meatiness, but the debate itself was fantastic free advertising, helping to propel Impossible into major chains like White Castle, and then, in the summer of 2019, into more than 7,000 Burger Kings across the US. To date, the company has raised over $1 billion, and a funding round in March valued the company at around $4 billion. But fake meat is a happening space these days, and Impossible faces some daunting competition.
Time now for the stock of the hour, and that is Beyond Meat. Shares of the faux meat or plant-based protein company are soaring today.
Beyond Meat is also making a very meaty burger from plants. They're very non-GMO. They stress that all the time to differentiate themselves from Impossible.
It would be much easier to genetically modify plant material to make it take on the texture and appearance and aroma of animal protein. Right. But we won't do that.
Beyond Meat had one of the biggest IPOs of the year in 2019. So Impossible, which is still privately held, has some catching up to do. But you won't hear Pat Brown knocking his biggest competitor.
I wish them nothing but success. They have the same mission we have. The only rival we care about is the incumbent animal-based industry.
Rivals or not, Impossible and Beyond certainly agree on one thing. The true prize isn't the American market, it's China. 27% of the world's meat is consumed in China, compared to just 9% in the US.
The Chinese population eats a ton of meat. They're a huge market. China's a really interesting case because they have long had vegetarian cuisine as part of their culinary culture, and whether they are looking for meat replacements is still an open question. What we found in our reporting is that some consumers are excited about them. It's just, we don't know if it's going to be enough.
To improve its prospects, Impossible is developing a plant-based replacement for pork.
Globally, pork is the most widely consumed meat. It's almost 40% of all the meat consumed globally. Number one in Europe, number one in China. So if we're going to achieve our mission, pork is, right up there.
No word yet on when Impossible pork will be available.
This morning, growing concerns about the nation's food supply.
From butchers to national supermarkets, supplies now limited and prices rising.
The impact of the coronavirus on the price and availability of meat has given a boost to companies like Impossible Foods. Over the 4 weeks ending April 19th, sales of plant-based meat increased. But Impossible has acknowledged some negative effects from the pandemic as well.
This being a product that has primarily been served in restaurants, they took a pretty big hit with all the food service shutdowns, although the company doesn't want to say, how much of a hit. They have, however, announced some new retail rollouts. Recently, they announced that they're going to be rolling out with Kroger supermarkets, and that's big. That's great for them. The question of whether this is like a long-term sea change for these companies, I don't know. Just have to wait and see.
It's safe to say Impossible stands a slim chance of achieving its goal of replacing the entire meat industry. But it's early days for the science of plant-based meat, and it's not impossible that these products could one day contribute to a greener, more humane future. In the meantime, as the technology improves, we get to look forward to many more years of this.
This is meat. Wait, no, this is Impossible.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
This is the meat burger. I like it better.
It's not even close to a veggie burger or a tofu burger or anything like that. It's very, very much.
Is a strategically important point on the map of Pakistan. It sits very close to Iran, actually, on the very southern coast. It's about a 10-hour drive west of Karachi, but it's only about an hour drive to Iran. The area is extremely poor. It's very arid. It doesn't have enough water. Electricity has been very spotty. One of the most surprising things about visiting Gwadar is the high degree of security that is absolutely everywhere. There are armed guards that are required to escort foreign visitors everywhere you go because it is a contested region, because there have been militant attacks in the past.
Despite all this, Gwadar is a key part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, also known as CPEC, the crown jewel of President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative.
We will leave no stone unturned in ensuring that CPEC and all the projects under its umbrella are materialized in time and in full.
So far, just 1/3 of all CPEC projects have been completed. In Gwadar, none of them have been, and the promised improvements for local people like job creation and better infrastructure have not materialized. So, what has China got to gain from developing this seemingly obscure city on the Pakistani coast?
We have seen this movie before. An outside power comes into Pakistan. It spends heavily on big infrastructure projects. China's not the first to do it. Right after Pakistan became independent in the late 1940s, early.
If they're not being employed to Ukraine specifically, why is that so important, and does that risk further provoking Russia?
Well, there's two things going on. So what the United States recently announced is that we are going to put 8,500 troops that are part of the NATO response force on high alert. That means they'll be ready to deploy on a moment's notice should we need those forces anywhere in Europe to protect NATO territory. In addition, the United States is also looking at possible additional moves that they might make to move U.S. force posture into Central and Eastern Europe. The reason we're looking at that is because a lot of the members in that neighborhood in Central and Eastern Europe feel concerned. And so we are looking at what measures we might take in the name of reassurance and deterrence.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
As a company grows, there are more challenges. What do you worry about the most?
The market opportunity for us is enormous, and so our challenge is to continue innovating, driving, and pushing ourselves every single day to go after the most attractive profit pools in this incredible global beauty and wellness market.
It will be appropriate to raise our target range for the federal funds rate at the March meeting.
Whoever's on the sanction list, they won't be able to use our platform. Whoever's not, they can.
If you're making $1 from Russia right now, I'd call it blood money.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition, everyone. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Russian forces advance in southern Ukraine. Moscow's invasion in the north appears to have stalled outside of Kyiv. The refugee crisis worsens. The UN estimates that more than 1 million people have fled Ukraine in the past week, and Jay Powell says he's keeping an eye on the impact of the war. But the Fed chair also plows ahead on rate hikes. And finally, oil hits its 2008 high. The Russian invasion upends the market. Brent crude tests the $120 barrier. Well, let's check in on the markets. And I have to say, in the last half an hour, we had a pretty stark reversal when it comes to a lot of the equities. Overall, we were gaining. Now they're pretty much flat. Now, European stocks flat, a little bit of volatility. Unclear exactly what they're nervous about, but it must be energy prices. Maybe they're pricing in further sanctions, or certainly they're just looking at the military offensive and trying to see how this ends. Basic resources, the story of the week when it comes to the markets, gaining some 3.2% overall, but we're seeing record highs on zinc. We're seeing Brent also possibly touching 120. If you look at the zinc, it did briefly touch 4,000. This is something huge. We don't often speak about zinc, but again, this is catalytic converters. It's used, of course, in a range of things that could make not only inflation much higher, but something that will really hurt. For example, fertilizer is something that we don't talk about very often, but because Russia and Ukraine make so much of it at a cheaper price, it could impact, of course, farmers that right now are looking at replanting some of the crops. Now, European natural gas futures rising to a record, and you can see the spike. We brought it back to last year to the early 2021, and you can see the impact. It's gone from about 25 to 200 right now. That will have an impact on travel companies, will have an impact, of course, on how we heat our homes and household spending as well. Now, the UN says at least 1 million refugees have now fled Ukraine since a Russian invasion began a week ago, mostly to neighboring European countries. This as fighting in Kiev and Kharkiv continue.
It hasn't been decided yet what would happen if the Russians withdrew. Again, that'd be part of whatever kind of diplomacy would unwind the crisis in Ukraine. Sadly, this, as you say, is a hypothetical question. We see no signs, unfortunately, that the Russians have any intention of withdrawing right now. And indeed, their military operations in Ukraine continue to escalate.
Meanwhile, the French President Emmanuel Macron offers support for Ukraine while acknowledging that the coming days will most probably be increasingly tougher.
Hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have already been killed. Women and children were killed again today. The coming days will most probably be increasingly tougher.
Now, for more, Aggie Cantrell joins us at the Medica border crossing in southeast Poland, and our Europe correspondent Maria Tadeo also joins us for the situation militarily on the ground. So, Aggie, what's it like, first of all, at the border as refugees try to cross in?
Hi, Francine. Yes, we're seeing refugees come across, many on foot, many in cars, coming across as a steady flow all morning this morning. And we're also seeing that as the fighting is intensifying and targeting civilian areas within Ukraine, we're also hearing that there are likely to be much greater flows coming over the border in the coming weeks. And I think it's important to note that with the new potential talks that may take place, a key part of those talks is establishing humanitarian corridors in Ukraine in order to make sure that supplies such as medical supplies and also humanitarian aid workers would be able to get to badly hit areas.
And Maria, there's been reports of more talks between Russia and Ukraine being held in Belarus today. What do we know about that?
Yes, Francina, remember there has been a huge back and forth because the Ukrainian delegation says that for them it's going to be very difficult to exit the capital if Russia continues to bomb the capital city of Kyiv in Ukraine. And they also worry about the implications that another round of talks in Belarus, which is de facto in many ways already a puppet state for Vladimir Putin. We have seen military operations from Belarus launched into the country. Now, even if they agreed on a time and place and this goes ahead, it is worth pointing out, and this is very important, that these are two countries that are far apart in terms of what they want to achieve from these talks. The Ukrainians say they want to talk predominantly about a ceasefire, and they want to continue with the process to enter the European Union. When you speak to the Russians, they say their goals have not really changed. That is, denazify the Ukrainian government. They continue to use that expression. It means they want to see a different government in Kyiv. They also talk about Ukraine giving up weapons. It is a risk for Russian security, they argue, and they also believe that the NATO and EU membership bid should end. It poses a risk to Russia. So unless those red lines move, it's very difficult to see how you get to anything that looks like a diplomatic resolution to this, Francine.
Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Aggie Cantrell on the ground in Poland, Maria Tadeo in Brussels. Now, we're also seeing scorching hot commodities, so let's check on what exactly we're looking at. This goes from wheat to, of course, some of the metals and energy prices as well. I'm looking at zinc. Zinc is something that we don't often talk about, but it reached its highest since 2007. Other industrial metals extending this powerful rally, really fueled by this trade turmoil, but also rising energy costs amid Russia's increasing economic isolation. Look at natural gas futures gaining some 11% today's trading session. Overall, the commodity index, the Bloomberg commodity index, one of the biggest gainers, gaining some 2.2%. Now, for the market reaction, joining us now is Christina Kino, our markets editor. Christine, we need to talk, of course, about the freezing of assets in Russia and also some of the indices being kicked out of the MSCI and others. But if you look at the commodities, it's unclear if what's already priced in is further sanctions, or they're just taking stock of what we've had so far.
Yeah, Francine, I think when it comes to taking a look at the commodity move today, it really is moving into this new phase now of realization in markets that this will be a prolonged conflict and this will have very, very big implications for the price of energy and for the price of food. Russia and Ukraine, of course, very much at the front and center of those commodity complexes, energy and food. And now that we're seeing really no signs of de-escalation in the conflict, in fact, more escalation, it really is dawning on investors that this will have such a huge impact on the price of commodities. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
Christine, is this why we're seeing quite a lot of volatility? So we started the day off, undecided. Then we had stocks up some 0.5% in Europe, and now we're back down. Are they also trying to make more sense of what Fed Jay Powell said yesterday?
Absolutely, Francine. I think it's a lot of catalysts that markets are trying to chew through at the moment. Of course, yeah, we heard from Powell overnight saying that they are committed to a rate hike in March and potentially flagging a 50 basis point move. That is unprecedented, of course. And we are seeing that reaction playing through in terms of Fed pricing. There are some contracts later on this year showing that possibility of a 50 basis point rate hike. But of course, that's pairing a little bit this morning as we head into the European trading day. I think what we're also seeing in terms of Europe and UK rates pricing, very, very interesting. The UK, for instance, once again, traders there are pricing 6 25 basis point rate hikes from the BOE for the first time since Thursday.
Chrissy, I mean, a 50 basis point hikes is really punchy if we're looking at stagflation. I mean, this could be a policy mistake.
Absolutely, Francine. And I think that risk, while that was a risk even earlier in February, it's even more so now because the stakes have really risen, both in terms of the potential hits to growth, but also in terms of really those inflationary pressures. We're not just looking at goods inflation, we're also looking at energy and food inflation because of the Russia-Ukraine situation.
Christine, thank you so much. As always, our Christina Aquino there, our markets editor, making sense of some of these moves. Coming up, Jay Powell sees a rate liftoff in March. The Fed chair also keeping an eye, of course, on Ukraine. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
The Omicron variant and the latest wave have an impact on not only consumer trends, but your business. And do you expect the booster shots to make a difference?
Yeah, booster shot will make a huge difference. I think it's been accelerated by the huge leadership of the current Prime Minister Kishida. And I'm hopeful that our business will come back in Japan around perhaps mid-February to end of February, because we expect that a peak time will come around that time. And then the government will shift toward the reinvigoration of consumer. That will help us. And we had seen the huge comeback of the business in December when the things were toward the normalization. So I believe the business will come back, and I'm very much hopeful.
Given the current situation, we need to move carefully. The near-term effects on the U.S. economy of the invasion of Ukraine remain highly uncertain. We will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. I do think it will be appropriate to raise our target range for the federal funds rate at the March meeting in a couple of weeks, and I'm inclined to propose and support a 25 basis point rate hike. To the extent inflation comes in higher or is more persistently high than that, then we would be prepared to move more aggressively by raising the federal funds rate by more than 25 basis points at a meeting or meetings. We will use our tools to add to financial stability, not to create uncertainty.
Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell there saying the central bank expects to raise interest rates later this month. Now that's in a bid to tackle hot inflation amid a tight labor market, while Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, has added uncertainty to the U.S. economy. Now let's get straight to Peter Shafrick, global macro strategist at RBC Capital Markets. Peter, first of all, this changes everything. With the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions, it changes the Fed's perspective and it changes the ECB's perspective. Are we looking at stagflation worldwide?
Well, first of all, good morning, Francine, and thanks for having me on. So, I mean, stagflation is a very strong word, but clearly this is a stagflationary impulse. And when we look at sort of how it transmits into the various economies, I would identify at the very least three sort of direct trade links, then certainly the indirect links through oil and gas, and then potentially sort of financial exposure. And it's very clear sort of that the euro area and with that the ECB is just much more exposed. We have more direct trade links. The European banks have more exposure. It's now sort of there's some mild contagion already into the other Eastern European countries where there is exposure. So it just feels so much more closer to home for the ECB. And when you look a little bit further afield, the further west you go, then obviously the exposure is smaller, but the principles apply all the same.
So what does it mean for ECB dynamics? How will Christine Lagarde be looking at this right now?
I mean, first of all, we heard it already. There's, I think Rain said it. There's a time for reflection here. So I think the announcements that were supposed to come as regards the APP or any other future policy in March, they must be off the table. I certainly don't think that they will happen. In fact, I think they probably have to shift a lot of their planned tightening further out. We have just changed our call. We don't think that rate hikes will be coming this year at all. And when you look at it, I mean, it's very difficult to quantify it, but the economy was bound to slow somewhat in the second half anyway. And with all the impacts that we're now having, as I just mentioned, direct and indirect, it's bound to be even more exaggerated. So I think it's very difficult for the ECB to hike in this environment.
What does it mean for the Fed? Actually, we heard, Peter, from Jay Powell yesterday. We also have a great chart looking at the financial conditions tightening in the U.S. Have you changed how many times you think the Fed will hike?
Well, in fact, we have. But in fact, we had already 4 in our profile, and we think that from everything that Powell has said, they're probably going to do even a little bit more. I mean, the situation in the U.S. is different. I mean, the direct channels, they're much smaller. The indirect channels, we'll have to see. And one of the key things that's also true in the U.S. as it is here in Europe is that high oil prices squeeze disposable income. And we know that particularly the lower income brackets, they already feel the pinch. But then the Fed has indicated that it is willing to go more aggressively. By the way, I think the Bank of England is sort of walking a similar tightrope here. So, but again, I think we'll have to see what the indirect impacts are, whereas in Europe, the direct impacts are larger.
Peter, give me a sense of what this all means for, and I know this is longer term, but I guess it's a good time as any for investors trying to understand how that shifts the dynamic for China.
I mean, for China, it's obviously also very, very difficult because on the one hand, politically they want to side with Russia, and there's a lot has been said about sort of that they want to see how the West is reacting. But on the other hand, it's a very large economy, and they're very dependent on producing a lot of goods for the rest of the world. So clearly, sort of the rest of the world going into, I don't want to call it a recession, but sort of in a lower growth environment, that's not good for them. And certainly, we've seen that they're trying to moderate here. But I mean, they've got their own problems in their own economy already anyway, because of COVID, because of leverage, because of all the other things that are going on. So the last thing they probably need is a significant slowdown in the world economy and the global economy. And therefore, I think they're trying to moderate here. But whether that can be successful successful is in my mind, is very unclear.
So is there something that you look at? I know there's, we look at the credit markets, we look at a lot of the bond volatility, we worry about liquidity. Is there a data point that's your go-to given all of the uncertainty right now?
It's not necessarily a data point, but if you allow me to take a step back, I do think it shifts a lot of things, particularly for Europe. I actually think that the sort of political scene is changing in Europe wholesale. It's very difficult in my mind for all of these right-wing politicians to sort of have the European breakup story still as one of their key things. So I think that's falling by the wayside. So I think that's changing. So the political mood in my mind is very important to gauge. But as you mentioned, markets, I think the credit market in my mind is really one of the things to watch, because we've seen credit being under pressure. We know that a lot of corporates now not only have exposure to Russia that they potentially have to write off, but also can't deliver into that market into the future, which is obviously taking some of their earnings away. So I think the credit market in my mind is the linchpin, is the most vulnerable part here.
Peter, thank you so much, as always. Peter Schaffrick there, global macro strategist at RBC Capital Markets, joining us this morning. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich is to sell Chelsea Football Club with the aim of donating the proceeds to victims of the war in Ukraine. The London club's fortunes have been transformed since his 2003 takeover. It's reported Abramovich is seeking bids of at least £3 billion for the business. Now, Russia's credit rating has been cut to junk by both Moody's and Fitch Ratings as risks mount that sanctions could undermine its capability and willingness to service debt. Moody's downgraded Russia's long-term foreign debt rating from Baa3 to B3. Fitch slashed Russia's 6 levels and placed its rating on negative watch, citing weakening public finances, slowing growth and elevated geopolitical risk. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, we're also getting some pictures out of Romania, where we're hearing, of course, Madame von der Leyen talking. We also heard from the Romanian president speaking a short while ago. I think we have the live pictures. If so, we'll go to it. And the Romanian president moments ago just saying that the EU must end a dependency on Russian gas. That's according to the Romanian president. We'll hear what von der Leyen has to say, and we'll get back to that shortly. Coming up, oil driving commodities' biggest week in almost 50 years. We take a look at the impact of both sanctions and the Iran deal. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
The Delhi airport, and behind me you can see SpiceJet 737 MAX aircraft. SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh earlier today said that Boeing is going to compensate SpiceJet in form of cash and aircraft. Celebration happening at the Gwalior airport. As you can see, they've literally rolled down the red carpet for SpiceJet Chairman Ajay Singh. there are balloons, there are flowers. This is a big deal for SpiceJet because it is the only Indian operator of Boeing 737 MAX planes currently.
How difficult was it to go to investors and say, invest, give money, put money into a travel tech company within this environment?
It wasn't that difficult because TravelPerk is doing much, much better than the rest of the industry. In fact, we are at the moment growing at 4 times revenue of pre-COVID numbers.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, we're, of course, looking at Budapest, where we hear both from President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Romanian president talking about refugees. The president, of course, of that country saying that he will do what he can in terms of helping with the refugee flow. Now, oil soaring as investors shun Russian crude prior to the invasion of Ukraine. The Iran nuclear deal was one of the key drivers for the oil market. Now, to discuss the latest on Iran, we have Golnar Montevalli, who leads our Iran coverage. Golnar, as always, thank you so much for joining us. What's the latest from the talks in Vienna?
So we had a very interesting development overnight. The head of the UN's IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, is set to travel to Tehran on Saturday. That's quite a key development because it shows that negotiators are very determined still to try and get a deal while they can, because these talks have been really on the edge for the past week. We had a moment a couple of nights ago where they were very close to collapse, according to some sources. So everything is still very much hinging on Iran's a particular demand that Iran has, that questions over its past atomic activities be closed, that those files and concerns about what it's done in the past be settled. And that's something that the IAEA feels that it cannot do because it questions the institution's independence. It feels that it compromises its independence, and other delegates in the talks are also pushing back against that. But obviously we're at a stage where by next week, if we get a deal, that would be quite significant for oil prices.
So, Golnar, how likely is it that we get this deal?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Everything hinges so much on one or two things that have been extremely tricky in these talks. Right now, with this trip happening on Saturday with the IAEA, it looks more likely now. But we're looking at, again, talks pushing into next week, I think.
Yeah.
So it's going to be crucial.
Golnar, thank you so much. Golnar Montevalli there from Vienna. We're also getting some breaking news out of the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, saying that the Russian and Ukrainian officials will hold talks today, Thursday. We'll see whether we have any more from Mr. Lavrov. I think he's briefing reporters on the ground in Moscow, and we'll, of course, have plenty more on whatever he says. Coming up, the biggest ESG topic of our time. We'll speak Russia-Ukraine with Mirova chief executive Philippe Zawati about how the Russia-Ukraine conflict has changed investing. This is Bloomberg.
When you think space, you probably think one space agency that travels under the radar is ESA, which is surprising considering what the European Space Agency has achieved and how vital it is to the global space industry.
We've collaborated with pretty much everybody who is involved in space exploration.
But ESA wants to be a leading force in furthering humanity's mission into space.
Commander Ground, do you copy? Copy.
If we want to have successful human missions to Mars, we are going to have to learn to live and work off-world in a different way. The place where we are going to learn to do that is on the moon.
Can ESA help humanity take its next giant leap?
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
From New York City. Here in London. In Sydney. In San Francisco.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
So recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story.
How are you thinking about those dynamics?
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Russian forces advance in southern Ukraine, but Moscow's invasion in the north appears to have stalled outside of Kyiv. The refugee crisis worsens. The UN estimates that more than 1 million people have fled Ukraine in the past week. The Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the same. And Jay Powell says he's keeping an eye on the impact of the war, but the Fed chair also plows ahead on rate hikes. Oil hits its 2008 high. The Russian invasion upends the market. Brent crude closes in on the $120 barrier. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, we're keeping an eye, of course, on what the foreign minister of Russia is saying. He's giving a joint interview not only to state TV in Russia, but with a few international broadcasters. And he's talking about, first, what exactly could happen between Russia and Ukraine. He mentioned that Russian and Ukrainian officials will hold talks later today. Of course, in the context of all of this is, for example, Gazprom's energy trading arm being kicked out of its central London offices. We're here based in London, so it's interesting to see how various regions or various countries are dealing with it. And this is really piling on more pressure on the company that's already been shunned by many UK trading partners and scrutinized by the government. We'll keep an eye on what Mr. Lavrov is saying, and we'll bring you the very latest from that as well. This is a picture for the markets. It's all about basic resources, and it's all about commodities. Now, we did have a bit of a reversal when it comes to some of the European stocks. The other thing I would watch out for is VIX. Now, the biggest week for commodities in close to 50 years is unfolding. This is part of our reporting. We see this global crude benchmark Brent taking aim at $125 a barrel. This is what a lot of analysts and insiders have been telling us. And we spoke to Jake Lloyd-Smith saying that, look, as long as enough buyers continue to shun Russian supplies after the invasion of Ukraine, that could possibly be within reach. And then zinc also touching 4,000, currently at 3,981. What we look at in terms of gas prices, and again, let me remind you that this is a headache for households. It's a headache for inflation, as more and more economists and analysts say that we could possibly be looking at stagflation. Unclear whether the central banks could protect us from something like that. Now, the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is gathering momentum, with Russian stocks finding themselves isolated from a large segment of the investment fund industry, including the MSCI and the FTSE Russell indices. Now, this, as many global corporates joined the boycott of Russia, with some executives condemning any business interaction with the country.
I would say to all my fellow chief executives and chairmen around the world and major shareholders, if you're making $1 from Russia right now, I'd call it blood money.
Now, for more on all of this, we're joined by Bloomberg's Benny Camel. So, Benny, we also try and figure out, the companies that have decided not to either ship or manufacture in Russia. We heard from Apple, Nike, Disney yesterday. What do we know about any more companies joining this boycott or exodus?
So the exodus is gaining momentum. We have more companies in the retail space in particular that have joined in here. We had big names like Burberry, like the online fashion retailer Boohoo, ASOS, H&M. All these companies are saying that they will stop supplying Russia. They will stop shipping products to Russia. For some of them, this is a bigger hit than for others. For Burberry, for instance, it's really a small part of their business. They make a lot of their money with Russians coming over here to London, to Frankfurt and so on, and buying their products there. But for companies like H&M, it does have a substantial effect on their business. For some companies, it's actually very hard at this point to do business in Russia. So it's not really a question of wanting to do business, but they are simply cut off from supply chains. We heard from DHL, the courier company, earlier this week that they will stop shipping to Russia. So this really makes doing business in Russia ever more difficult, and that is adding to the exodus.
So, Benedict, one thing, of course, is for a company to announce it's leaving Russia. How difficult is this in practice to entangle yourself from still the 11th biggest economy in the world?
It's very difficult indeed, and we're seeing this across the board. We heard from companies like BP, that was one of the first ones to say we're pulling out, and they will probably take a massive financial hit on this. Other companies that have fixed assets on the ground, be it installations in Siberia for oil and gas, be it shops and employees, actually pulling out of these assets is going to be very difficult and time-consuming. It'll take a lot of time. The announcement, as I said, is one thing, but actually pulling through on this is going to take much longer. And some companies are actually saying, we're staying here. We had a very interesting interview yesterday with the CEO of Bulgari, the luxury jewelry maker, which said, we are staying here for now. We're selling to Russians. We're not really in politics. We are accustomed to being in difficult markets. So you're seeing both sides, really. Some companies saying we want to stay in and others are pulling out.
Benedict, thanks so much. Our Benedict Camel there, of course, who oversees all of our coverage on business. Now, coming up a little bit later, we'll also speak to the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. Don't miss that interview. Joins us this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. London time. Now, moreover, an affiliate of Natixis that specializes in sustainable investing, thinks the conflict in Ukraine is the biggest ESG topic of our time. Well, Philippe Zoati, chief executive officer of the £24 billion asset manager, argues that the crisis will accelerate ESG investing trends and the EU's transition to renewables. Well, Philippe Zoati joins us now in the studio. So, Philippe, thank you so much. First of all, we need to talk about inflation. And I know one thing that's often forgotten in ESG, because people automatically think about climate change, is, of course, the social impact. Is this a question of morality now?
I don't think it's a question of morality. I think it's a question of understanding that, we cannot, basically do responsible investments without democracy. And so it's not a question of ESG becoming more moral or being moral. It's a question of ESG becoming more political. And I think we are just in front of a situation where we cannot just hide our ESG analysis only behind our analysis of companies. We have also to have a statement about where this business is made and how this business is made. And so it's about human rights, and it's about the fight to defend democracy.
But Philippe, it was perfectly acceptable actually to do business with Putin 2-3 weeks ago before we saw the shell and the bombing. So where do you draw the line? How do you handle China, for example?
Was it really acceptable? That's the question. It was acceptable in the market, in the business. But when we see, for example, some funds which are labeled responsible, especially under the SFDR regulation, like Article 8 fund, where you could find some Gazprom stocks, for example, it's questionable. It's questionable. We wrote a paper about a couple of weeks ago about China, and our position was very clear. We think that ESG should not help autocratic regime to finance themselves. So that means that investing in autocratic regime government bonds or companies or government-led companies bonds is really questionable for ESG investing.
Even if it's to help with the renewable transition. It's not always so black and white, right? When you see bombs fall, I understand, but otherwise...
Of course, but it's question of... I like the DNSH, do not significantly harm scheme of the European Union. That means that you can have something which is positive on one topic, but if this investment is making significant harm on another topic, you should not be there. You cannot just help energy transition with an autocratic regime and against democracy. This is, if not, we won't be able to do anything in the future.
So how does that limit? Have you actually done an analysis? Like, if you say what how does that limit? Like, what is off limit at the moment?
I think that clearly China is an issue. Absolutely. Russia was one. There are others. But again. The good thing I would say is that there is no complete. It's not orthogonal between the thinking about energy transition and what's happening in Ukraine. It's maybe the contrary. I hope that it will be exactly the contrary, but that the situation in Ukraine will help us to accelerate the energy transition, and we don't need to invest in Gazprom to do this, or to even in companies.
The problem for
the Russian government
is one of timeline, right? So I guess how often, and one of the things that we're trying to figure out in the market is if there was a blackout from Russia, if they were turn off the taps, what's the energy efficiency and transition that we could go through in Europe, and how does renewables help in that?
We are going to suffer from this, that's for sure. It will be painful, but we need to accelerate. Of course, not only the construction of renewable energy, but on the top of this, what we need is really to build an energy policy at the European level. That's what we lack today. We had a lot of discussion around the taxonomy, last weeks, and I was clearly against the inclusion of nuclear and gas in taxonomy, because we were just using the taxonomy in order to fix the question of energy mix. We need really an energy mix in Europe, and it will be, of course, mainly renewable.
All right, thank you so much. Philippe Zahawati there, the Chief Executive Officer of Mirova. We've been talking, of course, about this energy transition for quite some time and seeing exactly what we can see in the coming days. Now, Mr. Lavrov, the Foreign Minister of Russia, saying that Russian and Ukrainian officials will hold talks today. We'll have plenty more on that. This is Bloomberg.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that Communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, let's stay on the war on Ukraine. And President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed to the European Union to fast-track membership for his country. Despite support from several member states, Kyiv faces an arduous process that typically takes years. Now, in the last couple of minutes, we've also heard that the EU Council has now sent the request to the Commission on Ukraine membership. Now, to talk about all of this, Georgina Wright, Senior Fellow at the Institute Montaigne. Thank you so much, Georgina, for joining us. First of all, in terms of timeline, in the quickest possible scenario, how long would it take for this to happen? Years?
Hello, Francine. It really depends, to be honest. I mean, Finland took 2 years from the moment that it asked to join and the moment that it actually joined. And there are other countries like Turkey that have been in negotiations since 2014. So it's really difficult to say. I mean, there are a number of criteria that the Commission that will be reviewing Ukraine's formal application will be looking for. So, does Ukraine share European values? Is it in a place where it can actually absorb the EU's rule book? Does it have a well-functioning market economy? Does it have sound institutions? So there are a number of things that Ukraine would have to meet before actually the EU could declare it candidate country.
Georgina, would it give it some protection against military attacks? So once you're a part of the EU, this would certainly antagonize Vladimir Putin. Concretely, what does it mean?
So there is this mutual assistance clause, which is a little bit vague in the treaty, but it basically says that if there is an EU member state in need, the others must come to its defence. Now, we don't know if that means militarily, if it means politically, but I mean, beyond thinking about the mutual assistance clause, there is a question about, can a country in war realistically enter negotiations to join the EU? Because even if EU countries and the European Parliament say, do you know what, actually, yes, let's get Ukraine, let's grant it candidate status, there is a difference between granting a country candidate status and actually granting a country EU membership. So there is still a long way to go.
Georgina, where do we find out, or when do we find out actually the advancement of this? And when you look at, shared values, how difficult is this when there's a raging war going on in the country? I mean, it almost seems impossible. We've never seen anything like this before, right?
I mean, it's really tricky, for sure. And I mean, there are technical reasons why this whole process is complex, because, you've got to get EU countries and the European Parliament on board, and then you have to, have 35 chapter negotiations. So it means anything from sort of single market regulations to social policy. And then after that, you'll have voting as well. And if you're in the midst of a war, it's very difficult to have that bandwidth to really negotiate. But I think for Ukraine, it's an important political signal, right? Being granted candidate status. I think the Ukrainian government knows that there is a difference between being granted that status and actually becoming a member. But I think it's an important political signal, which, until 2 weeks ago seemed impossible.
How would Russia take that?
Well, that's the key question. I mean, I'm not the Russian government. I don't know, but it would be potentially seen as a provocation. Certainly, I mean, Russia's been very clear. Vladimir Putin, back I think in 2009 at the Munich Security Council, said, Ukraine should not become a member of NATO, and and sort of inferring there that actually EU membership should sort of not go beyond those sort of borders of the Baltic states. And actually, there is a question about Georgia, Ukraine, because Ukraine has submitted its formal application, but so has Georgia. And I mean, there is a question there about Russia trying, what is Russia's end game here? Is it trying to simply topple the Ukrainian government? Is it trying to annex Ukraine? Is it trying to create a sphere of influence? And if that's the case, then certainly Georgia and Ukraine on the road to membership will be seen as a provocation.
Georgia, you could see, a case in point where actually they start the process, but then if there's someone put in place in Ukraine by the Russian government, they just pull it, and that's the end of it.
So, I mean, it's all hypothetical at this stage, but certainly the EU, as I said, granting Ukraine candidate status is not the same as granting Ukraine membership. And there would be negotiations, and depending on what goes on, certainly the EU can just say, actually, let's pause this, let's stop this. I mean, there's no guarantee that if you are a candidate country that you will become a member. I mean, just take Turkey. Turkey has been in negotiations since 2004. I mean, they have been halted since 2018, but, there is no guarantee that Turkey will join anytime soon. And there is a concern on the EU side as well about saying, should we get our own house in order first? Should we resolve our internal tensions before we actually enlarge further?
Georgina, thank you so much for joining us. Georgina Wright there, Senior Fellow at the Institut Montaigne. Now, coming up, we speak to the Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ukraine after its rate decision. Don't miss that conversation just after 1 p.m. London time. This is Bloomberg. Now let's get to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Francine. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is making the fight against inflation his top priority over risks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In his testimony to lawmakers, Powell backed a 25 basis point hike later this month, adding that a bigger or more persistent rate hike path would be warranted if U.S. inflation stays hot.
I do think it will be appropriate to raise our target range for the federal funds rate at the March meeting in a couple of weeks, and I'm inclined to propose and support a 25 basis point rate hike. And to the extent inflation comes in higher or is more persistently high than that, then we would be prepared to move more aggressively by raising the federal funds rate by more than 25 basis point at a meeting or meetings.
Now, Russia's credit rating has been cut to junk by both Moody's and Fitch ratings as risks mount that sanctions could undermine its capability and willingness to service debt. Moody's downgraded Russia's long-term foreign debt rating from Baa3 to B3. Fitch also slashed Russia's 6 levels and placed its rating on negative watch, citing weakening public finances, slowing growth, and elevated geopolitical risk. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thanks so much. A look at commodities scorching rally. Zinc actually topping at some point $4,000. This is because, of course, of the Russia increasing economic isolation story. Now, commodity markets, metals, oil, gas, wheat, a lot of the agriculture, of course, upended by this Ukraine crisis as big corporates also withdraw from Russia, lenders pulling back from financing deals, and the threat of new sanctions deter buyers. If you look at gas futures, they're gaining some 2.5%, zinc 3% higher. Coming up for sale, billionaire Roman Abramovich puts Chelsea Football Club on the market. We look into the how sanctions are targeting Russia's wealthiest business people. More on our big take next.
This chip shortage is going to last longer than many people believe, likely straight through this year. And I wonder what that means for prices. Will this get worse before it gets better?
I don't know that it will get worse before it gets better, but there's no reason to believe it's going to get meaningfully better anytime soon. The Commerce Department put that data out yesterday, and what it showed is that there's a real shortage. Demand is 20% higher than it was a couple of years ago. There's a huge mismatch in supply and demand. Prices are high. Prices are higher. So what has to happen is we need to make more chips. Unfortunately, there's no easy solution. The solution is increased domestic manufacturing of chips, which is what we need to do.
Isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Roman Abramovich is selling Chelsea Football Club after almost 2 decades of ownership. Now, the Russian billionaire is seeking £3 billion from the sale of the football club. He says net proceeds will go to a foundation for Ukraine war victims. The billionaire has not been personally sanctioned by the UK government. Now, for more on our big take today, looking at how the sanctions are impacting oligarchs. So Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker joins us. Stephanie, has the West actually gone far enough with sanctions?
Well, I think you have to take each in turn. I think the EU has been the most aggressive in terms of sanctioning Russia and its wealthiest businessmen. On Monday, they sanctioned a handful of Russian oligarchs that have assets in the West and will very much feel those penalties. The UK has been noticeably slower in terms of sanctioning the oligarchs. They have talked a tough game, but haven't followed through. And I think there's now concern that just the threat of sanctions is allowing many of those Russian billionaires to get their assets out of the West and move and to escape the penalties before they come down. Of course, the US, UK, and the EU have coordinated these broader sanctions targeting banks and the payment systems that is hurting, across the board. But no, I think the sanctions can go further and will go further.
Yeah, and just minutes ago, the French customs officials have said they have seized a Russian-owned yacht. What is the end game of these sanctions, Stephanie? Is it to stop Putin and stop the war, or is it to penalize him longer term?
Well, because NATO does not want to get engaged in a direct conflict with another nuclear power, they're using sanctions as the main weapon to fight and support Ukraine in its war with Russia. And the idea is to starve Putin of the funds he needs to wage war. Now, of course, without an embargo or a block on Russian oil and gas, he will still be able to finance this war, but the blocking of access to central bank reserve, for instance, will have a huge effect. And the idea is by targeting Russian banks as well as wealthy oligarchs, that will in turn put pressure on Putin and raise the cost of waging this war.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie Baker, there was some great reporting. You can also, of course, read The Big Take in full on NI Big Take Go, and it'll be also part of Bloomberg Business Week. Now, this is a check on commodities. We've had a lot of volatility, actually, when it comes to markets since the beginning of the trading session. Now, if you look at commodities and what they've been looking at, some of the front-month dated contracts for delivery of various commodities will see prices extend gains. This is according to a couple of analysts that we've been speaking to as buyers look set to get their hands on materials now at any cost. So Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continues in the next hour with Matt Miller and Kate Lyons in New York, or Anna Edwards here in London. This is Bloomberg.
almost the end of the year, but Bali is still quiet and empty. I am here in Kuta Legian, one of the main walking streets here that is used to be a tourist spot for beach, dining, shopping, but many shops here are still closed. Most of the outlets are either for rent or for sale as they have run out of business.
Saya kerjanya di sini udah lama, udah ada 10 tahunan di sini kerja. Masih sepi sih, nggak kayak dulu. Kalau dulu kan rame, sekarang ya ada, 1-2 itu ada. Tapi nggak kayak dulu, kalau dulu rame sekali. Sekarang paling dapat jualan ya 100, 120 gitu, 200 ya. Kalau dulu sih ya nyampe dah 1 juta, 1,5 tuh nyampe dapat jualan. Bisa sampai 2 juta dulu. Sekarang nggak pernah lagi dapat segitu. Sama aja, belum ada turis ke Bali. Masih ya domestik aja.
While Bali has reopened its borders for foreign tourists since October, they're still not coming in. Many international airlines are yet to reinstate their direct flight to the island. Balinese people here really hope they can see more people from Australia, China, and Europe to come visit next year.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
However you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
There is a 700-pound gorilla in the room.
There are regions of the world which are in defense mode.
We are really thinking about risk management right now.
With $110 oil, it is that much more difficult.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kaylee Lines.
It's 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 6 p.m. in Hong Kong on this Thursday, March 3rd. Our top stories today. The war enters its second week. Russian forces are firing rockets at Kiev and stepping up their campaign in southern Ukraine. More than 1 million people have fled the country. Bloomberg is live at the border of Ukraine and Poland. More investors see the Russian market as uninvestable. MSCI and FTSE Russell cut Russian stocks from widely tracked indexes as Moody's and Fitch Ratings downgrade the country's credit rating. And it's the biggest week for commodities since 1960. Everything from wheat to aluminum is soaring. Oil's selling at its highest price since 2008. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kaylee Lines in New York. The pace of change, the pace of move higher in the commodities moves, Kaylee, really quite eye-watering in the early hours of the European trading day, something that certainly knocked the confidence of global stocks once again.
Yeah, you definitely are seeing big moves in commodities. You're also seeing a lot of volatility in the bond market as the market tries to assess what exactly central banks are going to be doing in light of this crisis. Of course, we heard from Chairman Jerome Powell of the Fed yesterday saying he does expect to lift off this month, but he is advocating for a 25 basis point hike. So as for where that left us in Asia overnight, there wasn't that much movement when it comes to equities. They were mostly higher. China one exception, but the MSCI Asia Pacific Index as a whole was up a little more than 0.5%. Japan was a bit of an outperformer. That may in part have something to do with the weakness we are seeing for the Japanese yen. It is weaker against the dollar by around 0.2%. 115.77 is where we trade. Not a lot of bid for that haven asset. Not a lot of bid for the safety in bonds either. Again, this comes back to the monetary policy equation. You are seeing selling pressure really across the world, and that includes at the belly of the curve in Australia. That's where you saw the biggest move with that 5-year yield moving up about 9 basis points overnight. Finally, of course, the moves in the commodity complex are not limited to oil oil, it's touching the metals, it's touching the ags. I wanted to point to iron ore, up for what is now going to be a fourth day in Singapore, higher by 6 percentage points today. We are very, very close to $160 a ton once again. Matt, a lot of concern there about demand and, of course, supply and a tighter market.
Yeah, I really think commodities are front and center again today. It's the third day in a row where commodities are kind of at the center of the story. Take a look at futures here. Not a lot of action. We're down, but after a big up day yesterday, the S&P closed 1.8% higher, even though we had a rally in oil again yesterday. The dollar index is getting a bid today, 1187 for the Bloomberg Dollar Index, 1188. So that's one place where you could say it looks risk off. On the other hand, Kaylee, as you mentioned, there was no bid really for treasuries. I didn't even put them in the chart here. Crude up another 2.6%, and this is West Texas Intermediate at $113.50 a barrel. Brent is over 116 right now. And Bitcoin, another risk-off indicator in a sense, down 2% right now at 43,218. The narrative that, you know, Russian oligarchs or just the wealthy in general would pile into digital currencies doesn't really seem to have played out, unless that's just given everybody else a chance to sell, Anna.
Yeah, something to talk about when it comes to Bitcoin, certainly. Let's have a look at the European map then, Matt and Kaylee. And it looks kind of mixed overall, but certainly when you come to the western side, you see that we are caught in something of a downward move today, down 0.3% on the FTSE 100. Fairly flat, actually, on the French market, a little bit heavier, the losses coming through in Germany, losing our footing perhaps a little bit because of the speed of those commodity price moves, which really were quite stunning coming out of the Asian session and into the European session. This is a sector that benefits, though, of course, up by more than 3% on basic resource stocks. The likes of Glencore, ArcelorMittal, Antofagasta, all up really strongly in the London session, as is the Brent price. But 116, the handle you rightly pointed to there, Matt, we were nearly at 120 just a few hours ago here in London. So certainly we've seen a great deal of pressure to the upside on Brent crude, a lot of self-sanction taking place when it comes to those Russian commodities. Polymetal, this is a gold producer based in St. Petersburg. It has a direct listing on the London market, so not one of the 28 GDRs that the LSE has said will not be trading in London anymore. This still trades. This still is a feature. We'll see where the politics of that goes, but it is being dropped by the FTSE 100, down another 30% today. It was already down 80% or so in terms of the position coming up to today. This is the ITV share price. This is a broadcaster, domestic broadcaster in the UK, but is a bit of a global story because they're trying to keep up in terms of investing in streaming, keeping up with the likes of Netflix, the cost of that, giving analysts something to think about, and that stock down by 14.5%, Kaylee.
All right, Anna, well, speaking of global stories, we're going to get a global picture on macroeconomics throughout the day today. We're going to get minutes from the ECB's latest meeting at 7:30 a.m. New York time. Then when it comes to U.S. monetary policy, Fed Chair Jerome Powell will be testifying again on Capitol Hill, this time before the Senate Banking Committee. That will begin at 10 a.m. New York time. And finally, on the economic data front here in the U.S., initial jobless claims and durable goods today, all teeing us up for Jobs Day tomorrow, Matt.
All right, so we'll focus on those things for sure, but of course the war remains front and center. Fighting intensified in Ukraine overnight. An increasing number of people are fleeing the country for its western neighbors. More than 1 million have fled Ukraine since the invasion began last week. French President Emmanuel Macron has acknowledged that even tougher days are ahead.
Hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have already been killed. Women and children were killed again today. The coming days will most probably be increasingly tougher.
Let's get to our reporters around the globe. From the Polish-Ukrainian border, we're joined by Bloomberg's Aggie Cantrill. From outside of European Parliament in Brussels, we're joined by our European correspondent, Maria Tadeo. In Washington, D.C., Bloomberg government reporter Jack Fitzpatrick. Let's start, though, Aggie, with you at the border. What's the situation look like on the ground this morning?
Hi, Matt. This morning we've seen a steady flow of refugees arrive from Ukraine. This has been the case for the last several days now. And as you said, there is concern that the flow of refugees is going to intensify as the fighting intensifies. Now that we're seeing places like Kiev and Kharkiv being hit, we're also hearing from the WHO that there's an urgent need for humanitarian corridors within Ukraine in order to get medical supplies and aid workers to those desperately needing areas. It's also clear here that there's also a lot of need on the Polish side to bring humanitarian aid over to Ukraine.
Aggie, thank you. Aggie Cantrell there at the border. Let's get to Maria Tadeo for the political side of this. She joins us from outside the European Parliament in Brussels. Maria, there is speculation of more talks today. We've certainly heard that a couple of times from the Russians. What are the Ukrainians saying?
Well, Anna, the Ukrainians say, to cut a very long story short, that these talks will be pointless if Russia continues to put on the table what they believe is a request for total capitulation, meaning a new government to ditch that bid for NATO and EU membership, and of course to give up weapons, Ukrainian weapons, to Russia and demilitarize the country. The Ukrainians say this would be unacceptable, and the one thing they want to talk about, or the only thing they want to talk about, is a ceasefire for that very humanitarian reason Aggie just reported on the border with Poland, but also a way out that would include Russian troops moving away from Ukraine, which is now problematic, as you know, because they're knee-deep into the country. The other thing that I wanted to point, Anna, and it shows you just how real-life sanctions are beginning to apply. The French government says that it has requested and will seize the mega yacht of the Rosneft's CEO that is now parked in a port in France. And the French continue to say this is just the first of many other operations. We're going to go after assets of all Russian oligarchs again as a result of the sanctions that could, I hear, even potentially increase in the next few days.
All right, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo in Brussels. And of course, Bloomberg's Big Take story today focuses on those oligarchs. We'll have more on that later in this program. But first, let's get over to Washington. President Biden is trying to pressure Vladimir Putin over the invasion of Ukraine by sanctioning Russian banks and those oligarchs. We heard from Ron Klain, White House Chief of Staff. He spoke yesterday on how he sees the war in Ukraine developing.
It hasn't been decided yet what would happen if the Russians withdrew. We see no signs, unfortunately, that the Russians have any intention of withdrawing right now. And indeed, their military operations in Ukraine continue to escalate.
So let's get to Jack Fitzpatrick, Bloomberg government reporter who's joining us from D.C. Jack, there's some concern now that the Biden administration is not giving Vladimir Putin an exit here with the imposition of these sanctions. How are they thinking about, or have they vocalized what they would like to see from Putin to start seeing some of these things relax?
Well, there's been no detailed plan that shows us what the best case scenario end to this is, and that is cause for concern. It's interesting that at the same time that some outside experts are raising the issue, that there doesn't appear to be a very convenient out for Vladimir Putin. On Capitol Hill, the tenor really is focused on continuing to ratchet up the sanctions and applying more and more pressure to him. Over the last 24 hours or so, we've heard from more lawmakers, the pivotal one, of course, being Senator Joe Manchin, saying there should be more energy-focused sanctions, cutting off U.S. purchases of Russian oil and gas. It was a bit surprising, after hearing a bunch of Republicans talk about that, we even heard the progressive Senator Ed Markey express support for that. So there's actually a bit of a counter push on Capitol Hill to continue increasing the pressure, despite the fact that there are some concerns that there's not a clear path for Putin to, with some level of dignity, pull out of this and take the loss. So it's a very high pressure situation, and I think at this point it's a matter of continuing to ratchet up that pressure.
Jack, the budget is coming due on March 11th, right? The government's funded until then, and typically we see last minute, work that pushes that forward or gives us a new budget. How does the war situation change the typical Washington mechanism?
It complicates it a bit. It may actually push it along. They're discussing attaching a couple key emergency issues to the broader government funding measure that's due by the end of the night next Friday. One would be a Ukraine spending supplemental. The number on that continues to rise as we look at the humanitarian costs. The last I've heard from the House Appropriations Chair, Rosa DeLauro, was it could be looking something around $10 billion. That could actually motivate lawmakers to get moving on everything else they need to do. It has raised some questions about whether they take that money out of other programs. Mitch McConnell said they had gotten tripped up on that question a bit, but the goal is still to do government funding, Ukraine spending, and probably also a supplemental focused on the Omicron variant, all by the end of next week, which is a very fast pace and is going to be difficult, but that's what all lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are saying is the goal.
Jack, thanks very much. Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. Now, MSCI and FTSE Russell are cutting Russian equities from widely tracked indexes, isolating the stocks from a large segment of the investment fund industry. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Danny Berger. This is fast moving, isn't it, Danny? There's a lot of changes coming thick and fast at the markets. Take us through the latest here.
Right, well, these are two of the biggest index providers in the world, so there are billions of dollars that are going to have to be divested from passive funds. Let's work through these numbers to get a better understanding of exactly what this is going to look like. So according to Bloomberg Intelligence, funds in the US and Europe hold about $13 billion worth of sanctioned stocks from Russia. So that's just the sanctions one, so add a bit more on that for all of Russia. Now, of those funds, it is passive funds that hold the largest chunk of that. Vanguard, for example, holds more than $2 billion. BlackRock, $1.5 billion. And who do these funds track? Well, for Vanguard, it's FTSE Russell, and for BlackRock, it's mostly MSCI. So now these companies are going to have to offload these stocks from their funds. How do they even do that, though, in this scenario? FTSE Russell, for their part, has said that they're going to take these Russian stocks that are suspended in the indexes and value them at a big old fat goose egg, 0. So likely that means if you're an ETF provider, because you can't sell these securities, you just mark them down to 0, you move them aside to a different pile. So now a lot of these funds are just going to be holding worthless stocks that are illiquid, and they're not going to be able to offload.
All right, so people really can't sell some of these assets at this point, Danny. Yeah. Also, people, whether sanctions are in place or not, are acting as if they cannot buy Russian commodities, oil and gas. That is leading a lot of people to bid up commodities. Can you just put the moves we are seeing into context?
All right, well, superlatives abound. You have crude at its highest since 2013. For Brent, you have WTI that it's its highest since 2011, touching a 2008 high. Again, it's as you say, people just aren't willing to touch crude coming from Russia. They're not willing to trade it. The ships aren't willing to get it as well and transport it. Now, it's not just crude, it's also European gas, which has taken off. It's commodities, which very similarly, people don't want to touch for Russia. All of that means that the moves that we've seen up to Wednesday was an 8.6% rise in the Bloomberg Commodity Spot Index. That's already the best week since 1974. And given today's moves, we're likely going to add to that, and it's going to be, at least at the moment we stand, the biggest gain in the price of the Bloomberg Commodity Index on record, Kaylee.
All right, superlatives galore indeed. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Danny Berger. Now, that move we're seeing in commodities is reflecting back into some of the stock action we are seeing in pre-market trading here in the U.S., in that some energy stocks are outperforming. The likes of Marathon Oil, Devon Energy, they're each higher by a little more than 1.5% this morning. There's a few other movers to the downside, though, more idiosyncratic stories. One is Ralph Lauren. It announced yesterday its chief commercial officer was resigning after a misconduct investigation. It didn't really hit the stock yesterday, but that is getting sold dramatically this morning, down the better part of 10%. But it's an even bigger move to the downside for Snowflake. This is that cloud software provider. It gave a disappointing revenue outlook. Thinks sales growth is going to slow from the triple-digit percentage gains that it once enjoyed, and that stock is really getting hit hard this morning, down more than 21% before the bell, Anna.
Kaylee, let me just get to some breaking news very briefly. Intesa says its presence in Russia is under strategic review. So we continue to watch various companies around Europe and what they are doing in Russia, and this in the banking sector, crucial to get a bit of better understanding of exposures and future plans. It's also crucial in the auto space, where we're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of companies talking about either keeping or moving out of their links with the Russian market. Coming up, we'll get the views of Carlos Ghosn, the former Renault-Nissan CEO. He will talk to us from Beirut. He'll weigh in on the latest in the auto sector and, of course, the devastation in Ukraine. And former Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko, that conversation at 10 a.m. in New York, 3 p.m. in London. Plus, the end of an era for oligarchs, how sanctions are punishing Russia's wealthiest businessmen. More next from our Big Take. This is Bloomberg.
What do you think is the impact of the Prime Minister on the market?
As Mr. Suzuki, who is the Financial Services Minister, he mentioned at his own press conference, and share buybacks is widely used to return profits to shareholders and improve ROE. And how to share out the profits from growth is, totally the decision of the management of each company after carefully taking, all the stakeholders into consideration. And I believe Mr. Kishida has a quite cautious stance on the uniform regulation of share buybacks. And I think because he is giving a consideration to each company's, individual circumstance and, decisions.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Russia invades Ukraine.
We have proven our strength.
The nature of this war changed yesterday.
Turn to Bloomberg for up-to-the-minute reporting from around the world.
Ground troops are closing in on the Ukrainian capital.
Swiss abandon neutrality. And analysis of what it all means to you.
Energy is on the table.
We can see oil prices moving closer to 120.
There is a lot of interest to offload Russian assets.
Look to see more companies announce their exits from Russia.
Keep it tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller with Kaylee Lyons here in New York, Anna Edwards with us in London. I'm looking at financial conditions right now and how they've been affected by the Russian war in Ukraine. For those of you watching on television, this is the FCON. You can see it finally going negative here in red with the Fed expected Fed changes in white. For those of you listening on radio, I will just say this. I know you're driving to work. When you get there, pull up on your Bloomberg terminal, FCON Go, to look at the financial conditions, and you will note that we've been so loose for so long, it should be a shock to the economy that we get this tight. Ven Ram joins us, Bloomberg cross-asset strategist out of London. Ven, what do you see in terms of the effects of tightening financial conditions on the Fed, on the ECB, on the dollar, on the euro? This has such broad implications.
Morning, Matt. Absolutely. I think that, we've got these financial conditions that I think it's a product of what the Fed and the ECB have been doing for so long. I think we have stayed too loose to where we needed to be. And this is a catch-up that we need to do. And inflation in the US, as you know, is running north of 7%, the highest in decades, in 4 decades. And here we have a situation where the Fed funds rate is effectively at zero. So, I mean, this is an economy that has proven itself to be so resilient, even through the pandemic. And after that, and this year, we are expected to see a growth of 4%, give or take, a couple of hundred basis points for the Russia shock. Even so, that's well above trend growth. And what have we got? We've got rates at zero bound. And I think that's simply not an excuse for the markets. And for the Fed, I think that the message is clear that they need to go tighten, and they need to do it as of yesterday, and they're way behind the curve.
As of yesterday, even some Fed officials pointing out the distance between where they should be and where they are. Ven Ram, thank you very much. Bloomberg Markets Live. Remember, you can get more market analysis. Check out MLIV Go on your terminal. This is Bloomberg.
this going to primarily be chips for your own business, or is this going to be more centered around the foundry business and external customers?
It's going to be both. And what we said today is we're announcing 2 fab modules. It's a large location, 1,000 acres, because I'd hope to build out a full 8 fabs or more on this location. And, you know, if we do that full project, it would be $100 billion over the course of the decade or so. So a massive project, initially 3,000 jobs, 7,000 construction workers, supply chain, et cetera. I mean, this is just fabulous. And the products will be our most leading edge chips. So as we said, this will be the angstrom era when we're going to 2 nanometers and below into the angstrom era. So it'll be the most advanced chips, potentially the largest manufacturing location in the world. We'll use its output for our internal products, but also for those of the foundry customers as well. So it's going to cover both.
Capital markets can really help the shift to sustainable and decarbonized global economy. What are you noticing in that as ESG is now the buzzword literally everywhere?
It is definitely the topic of conversation in most meetings I have with company CEOs, with investors, with industry groups. It's amazing.
In crypto, you have a world of young people that want their own financial system and their own culture. And it is very powerful, and I'm a big believer in it.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. China's leader Xi Jinping is engulfed in crisis just when he wanted stability the most. Xi is laying the groundwork for a likely 3rd term as president. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is growing the least in 3 decades, the housing market is slumping, and the invasion of Ukraine is forcing China to reassess its support for Vladimir Putin. China's annual legislative meetings begin on Saturday, and lawmakers may push Xi for change. And in Japan, former Nissan director Greg Kelly was found guilty of helping Carlos Ghosn underreport his compensation. A court in Tokyo gave the American executive a 6-month suspended sentence. Ghosn and Kelly were arrested on the same day in November of 2018, but Ghosn made a spectacular escape from Japan in a private jet. And we are about to talk to the man himself, Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. We will talk to Carlos Ghosn, former Renault-Nissan CEO. We'll get his reaction to the verdict on Kelly, but we'll also talk about the issues that the global auto industry is now facing. This is Bloomberg.
estudio, en nuestro experimento, no hemos pintado todos los edificios de blanco, sino estos más asequibles de pintar. Y ya hemos detectado reducciones medias en el área metropolitana de 0,8 grados aproximadamente en un periodo de ola de calor y con picos máximos de 4 grados de disminución en un momento puntual del día, en una zona puntual del día. Y como dices, en una ciudad como Barcelona funciona incluso mejor que las zonas verdes, según las modelizaciones nos detectan incrementos, o sea, disminuciones de temperaturas mayores con tejados blancos que con incrementos de zonas verdes como tienen planteados el plan director urbanístico.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Here's what you need to know. The war in Ukraine has now entered its second week. Russian forces are pressing ahead with their offensive. They fired missiles at the capital city, Kyiv, and they stepped up their campaign to take cities in the coastal south. More and more, the Russian market is being seen as uninvestable. MSCI and FTSE Russell are cutting Russian stocks from widely tracked indexes as Moody's and Fitch downgrade the country's credit rating. Commodities are on track for their biggest weekly gain since at least 1960. Oil selling for the most in 14 years, so is wheat, and aluminum has set an all-time high. Importers and shippers are staying away from Russian exports in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. I'm Anna Edwards in London. Matt Miller and Kaylee Lyons with me, of course, in New York. And Matt, clearly the big ramp up that we've seen in commodity markets is dialed back from just how frantic and frenetic it was in the early hours of the European trading day, but still a substantial rally in commodities.
Yeah, I mean, it continues after the amazing moves that we've seen over the last couple of trading sessions. And markets may not be responding terribly well. Although, you know what? We had a great up day yesterday, even as crude continued to gain. S&P futures right now down about 0.25%. So the mood is a little bit more risk off. Investors are buying the U.S. dollar index today. So the Bloomberg dollar index up to 1187. But crude continues to gain. I mean, yeah, we're not looking at 5, 6, 10% gains, still up another 260 today to 113.30, and this is for NYMEX. Brent's at 116, so it's pretty impressive. Bitcoin, on the other hand, down right now 2%, and this, you know, to some extent, I think this puts an end to the idea that people with loads of rubles and nowhere else to go were piling in to the digital currency because that would have moved the needle, and we didn't really see it go that high. So 43,211 is where we stand on the main digital currency. Kaylee, what do you see in terms of pre-market movers?
Well, a lot of what I'm seeing in terms of the individual stock action is actually related to the broader macro moves and what we're seeing with the gains across the commodities complex. That's true for stocks tied to oil. Some of the energy players out there, including Occidental Petroleum, it's higher by about 1.3%. You have some of the big majors like Chevron and Exxon higher too, though as oil is off of session highs, they are also off their pre-market highs. Exxon is up just about a third of 1% or so. You also, of course, aren't just seeing gains in oil, you're seeing it in the ags, you are seeing it across the base metals complex, and that is translating into some of those materials-oriented stocks, the likes of Freeport-McMoRan, which is higher by 1.6%, and you also have U.S. Steel up by about 0.75% before the bell, Anna.
Yeah, and picking up on what you've been saying there about some of the stocks that maybe benefit from the higher oil price, we certainly see that here in London. But the broader story is a weaker one. So, Kaylee, the stocks here in Europe down by around 0.6% on the Stoxx 600. The basic resources sector, though, is up by 3%, as you can see. So that's really out of kilter with what we're seeing elsewhere. And that is because, that is, of course, because this sector set to benefit from higher commodity prices. We see the likes of Glencore, ArcelorMittal, Anglo American all moving to the upside. Brent crude, $115 a barrel, up by another 2%. It seems OPEC Plus not in any hurry to bring more barrels to the market in response to the higher energy prices, the self-sanctioning against Russian commodities that's going on. Natural gas prices jumping to another high. This week we've taken out those highs of December last year, and so that's where we are on the natural gas story as a whole, even though the most recent move appears to be to the downside. Polymetal, this is an interesting gold mining company based in St. Petersburg, direct listing on the London market. So it looks as if it keeps that for now. The stock is down by 31% in today's trading session as a number of the GDRs listed in London, the depository receipts, are taken off that market. And we see Polymetal excluded from the FTSE 100, Kaylee.
All right, so you're seeing the exclusions there. You've also seen this week a growing number of global companies choosing to cut back ties with Russia or cut them entirely after its invasion of Ukraine. Let's get an update from Bloomberg's Danny Berger. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the list just continues to get longer.
It does, and it's multiple industries, it's oil, it's airlines, it's tech, but really where the list has been very consistent and nearly every day hearing about someone new is autos. Yesterday, it was Mercedes-Benz. You're welcome, Matt, I'm not calling it Daimler. Mercedes-Benz saying that they wouldn't export to Russia. So Mercedes joins a long list of companies in the auto space who are no longer doing business in Russia. It's GM, it's Ford, it's Harley-Davidson, it's Daimler Truck, and beyond just doing business in Russia, there's also a logistical issue, which a lot of these car makers are now facing because there are car part factories in Ukraine. So already these car makers were dealing with a chip shortage, but for example, we've heard from VW and BMW who have said that they're likely to stop production, idle it, or be forced to shut down because, again, the shortages which won't allow them to put out car parts. Now, beyond that, one of the most exposed autos to Russia is Renault, and Russia is the second biggest market for Renault thanks to its partnership with an automaker there. And because of that, there's been a very severe sell-off since the war began. So at the moment, Renault now trading at its lowest since November 2020, Matt.
Yeah, we've seen it drop by a third over the last couple of weeks. Danny Berger, thanks very much for the roundup. Joining us now is Carlos Ghosn, the former CEO of Renault Nissan. Renault made its big move into Russia under Ghosn's leadership. He joins us now from Beirut, Lebanon, where he's in exile after dramatically leaving Japan while awaiting trial on financial misconduct. Mr. Ghosn, a lot of talk about with you, including the suspended sentence of former Nissan director Greg Kelly, which we will get to in a moment. But first, due to the war, we're seeing so many supply chain issues. And I just wonder what your thought is on how Renault survives this. Such a big presence in Russia, such big exposure with AvtoVAZ. Can they even get through it?
Look, I think, frankly, the question should be addressed to the leaders of the company and not to the ex-leaders of the company. What I can tell you is when we decided to move into Russia and make this alliance with AvtoVAZ, everything was fine. We were here on a mission to modernize the car industry in Russia for the benefit of the Russian users, but also for the benefit of AvtoVAZ itself and Renault itself. It made a lot of sense. We worked hard. We modernized the company, and everything was going well. This present situation has nothing to do with an industrial strategy. This is more a political situation on which the present leaders of the company should make statements. And I'm very surprised they're just not saying anything, even though, as you said, the share collapsed by practically 1/3 in a couple of weeks. But they are used to that because the share collapsed by more than 1/3 in the previous 3 years due to the bad result of the company. And frankly, we did not have any serious explanation about that. So I'm not surprised about this just neutrality in front of a situation which requires the leaders of the company to stand up, to make a position, to reassure the market and to reassure their own employees.
Let me ask you this then, just in terms of the supply chain, because Carlos, we've gotten a number of different outlooks from different manufacturers, but we're seeing now so many companies halt production. How important is Russia? How important is Ukraine to the global automotive supply chain?
Frankly, I think they are important, but they are not so important. I don't think that you're going to cripple the supply chain of the car industry because of what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. There are going to be hurdles, there are going to be challenges, but I don't think any car manufacturer has massive supply coming out of these two countries. This doesn't mean that there will be no problem, but management is here to solve them.
Good morning to you, Carlos. You left, of course, a business that was in an alliance, Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi, which you're very familiar with. Do you think that what we're seeing now, the difficulties in Russia for many automakers, do you think that that will change the shape of the alliance at all?
Oh, well, I think this particular fact between Russia and Ukraine is not going to change the face of the alliance. The alliance, in my opinion, took a huge hit in 2018. Frankly, I think it's a zombie today. They're not working together. They're just maintaining an appearance of the alliance. There is no vision, common vision between the companies. There is not this ardent desire to work together and to benefit from this corporation. In my opinion, it's doomed, because the only reasons for which you have an alliance between different companies is this willingness to work together, to make hard decisions together. And we have not seen any of this for the last 3 to 4 years.
Well, speaking of decisions the alliance may be forced to make, we're hearing now from Volkswagen it will be stopping production in Russia and halting all exports to Russia. That is according to its CEO. The headline's just crossing the terminal. So, Carlos, if you were still in charge, what would you be doing in Russia? Do you think Renault should be making a similar move?
Again, you know, I'm not in charge, but I can tell you that if I was facing a crisis like this, the first thing is I would make a diagnosis, an exact diagnosis of the supply chain, and I will take not only immediate decision, but I would be communicating about these decisions, not only to reassure people, you know, the stakeholders, the shareholders from one side, the employees from the other side, even the partners in Russia. So in a certain way, they have nothing to do with what's going on, which mainly is a political issue. And I'm stunned by the fact that it's complete silence. There is nothing dictated by the company. What I can tell you is I would have been on the front line. I would have devised the plan in function of the present situation of the company that I don't know anymore, because as you know, left for now more than 3 years. But I would be trying to put a plan, reassure people, and tell them how we're going to be working from now on.
Getting on to other matters, Carlos, and of course, we've seen the court verdict in Japan today, finding the former director of Nissan, Greg Kelly, guilty of helping you to underreport compensation. I know that you've said he's innocent and you've contested the charges against yourself, but then you escaped from Japan. He has not escaped from Japan, and he had to go to court. How does it make you feel to see that he had to stand in court and you won't have to?
Look, I am first relieved for Greg and his family, because finally he's going to be able to leave Japan and to reunite with his family in Tennessee. So he has had 3 years and 4 months of an ordeal that is about to end. I hope he will be able to cope with the tremendous damage, psychological damage, emotional damage, financial damage that he has been through, which is fabricated by the hostage justice system of Japan, triggered and manipulated by Nissan. Now, you know, I just want to give you one case. Look at the case of Greg Kelly in the United States and the one in Japan. In the United States, the SEC made an investigation and ended up making a settlement with him. It took 3 months, and he had to pay a $100,000 fine, okay, for the same charges. In Japan, it took them 3 years and 4 months, where he maintained hostage in Tokyo. He was arrested, even though he had an acute medical condition, and he was put 1 month in solitary confinement. There is a total unbalance between what could happen into a developed country and an acceptable justice system and the hostage justice system in Japan. Now, he is obviously innocent. If he was guilty, I don't know why the Japanese executives who worked with him, who colluded with him, are not there. That's not mentioned.
I mean, Carlos, we know that they almost always convict. So there was really no question on that front. What does this mean for you? What does this mean for your future? Will you stay in Beirut forever?
I don't think so. I hope not so. I think this is a safe face verdict. It's a safe face. It was predictable. it was obvious within their system. What does it mean for me? Obviously, my fight continues. I'm trying to fight my rights in Japan, even though, frankly, I'm not very optimistic about having any fair treatment into the Japanese court. I'm not talking about the criminal case. I'm talking about the civil lawsuit. But I think what's extremely important is to see that, you know, Nissan has pleaded guilty from the beginning, knowing that the maximum they would get is 200 million yen, which is $2 million of fine. $2 million of fine. That means it's laughable. That means the big risk of the company is to say, okay, I'm going to charge the ex-leader of the company. My risk is $2 million, while from the other side, my real result, and which is the victory for them, is I'm going to eliminate any idea of merger at the level of the alliance, and I'm going to eliminate any possibility of further convergence between Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi. This is the real deal for which they have done all of this.
Carlos, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today. Carlos Ghosn, the former CEO of Renault Nissan, speaking to us there from Beirut in Lebanon. Now, coming up on the program, we'll get back to the macroeconomics. Sarah Cuban, chief economist for Americas and Europe at Standard Chartered. Of course, yesterday we heard a lot from Jerome Powell, and that's what sent stocks higher in yesterday's session and through into the Asian session. How much do we still rely on the testimony of Powell to take us through the rest of this week, given what we're seeing in commodities? Sarah weighs in next. This is Bloomberg.
What's happening on Wall Street?
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
Given the current situation, we need to move carefully. The near-term effects on the U.S. economy of the invasion of Ukraine remain highly uncertain. We will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. I do think it will be appropriate to raise our target range for the federal funds rate at the March meeting in a couple of weeks, and I'm inclined to propose and support a 25 basis point rate hike. To the extent inflation comes in higher or is more persistently high than that, then we would be prepared to move more aggressively by raising the federal funds rate by more than 25 basis points at a meeting or meetings. We will use our tools to add to financial stability, not to create uncertainty.
Fed Chair Powell testifying before a House panel yesterday, making it clear that the fight against inflation is his top priority, even over the risks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, of course, Powell will be heading to the Senate today. Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent, is joining us now for more. So, Mike, do we expect to hear more of the same from the chairman?
More of the same, I think. He's pretty much told Wall Street what it expected to hear, and I'm not sure there's a lot he wants to add to what he said. He did say 25 basis points, which was a little bit surprising that he came out and preempted the committee meeting, because people know what Jay Powell wants, Jay Powell's going to get. But there was a little politics, surprising for Washington, I know, in this comment about 50 basis points, because he's telling the hawks, I'm going to listen to you. We will consider the idea of moving faster. So you, Jim Bullard, you, Chris Waller, you're not totally out of this, but I don't think we should start there. Obviously, they're still sticking to their prediction that we're going to see inflation fall this year, fall back, maybe not as far as they had anticipated. We'll get some new forecasts when they meet in March, but also that Russia's war brings a lot of uncertainty, and there isn't a whole lot the Fed can do about that. At this point, they have to wait and see what happens. So where are the markets as we go forward into the second day of this? Well, surprisingly, we gained a little. We're not a full percentage point, but you look at where we are right now, and then for those of you who are on radio, as Matt tells you, go pull this up on your terminal. But the white line is where we think we'll be as far as Fed funds futures in July. About 3 moves and about 6 moves total. That's the end of the year in yellow there. So the markets had sold off more. Now they think the Fed is going to be coming back, and that may be less to do with Powell than the war and oil prices. But we'll see when we get to March 16th where they end up.
Michael, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Mike McKee with an update there on what we heard from Jerome Powell. Sarah Hewitt, Standard Chartered Chief Economist for Americas and Europe, joins us now. Sarah, good morning to you. A lot of people digging out the history books right now and trying to work out where things head geopolitically, where things go from a market perspective and economically. And I wonder if there are periods in history that you're also reaching back to. Some people talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, others about the 1970s. And with oil prices on a tear, it's easy to see why. Are there parallels with history? Do we rhyme with history right now, Sarah, do you think?
Well, it is certainly worth looking at historical precedents, and I think that we're seeing the impact of those comparisons in the markets today. On oil prices, obviously, we know that recessions have often come in the wake of a surge in oil prices. And even in real terms, the current rise that we've seen now puts us into that sort of territory. On the geopolitical front, just the mere talk about escalating to nuclear, even though it seems unthinkable, is clearly going to be damaging to confidence and sentiment. Obviously, the hope is that talks will eventually result in some sort of stabilization of the situation, but I don't know that hopes are particularly high for the next round of talks. And unfortunately, at the moment, it looks as if the crisis is going to be escalating rather than settling down.
In terms of the commodities run that we've seen, Sarah, how much further do you think it can run?
Again, it's very much hostage to headlines. I think there's clear disappointment on the reserve release yesterday, too little, too late. And now we're seeing more talk from Europe about potentially cutting off from Russian supplies altogether. So we're seeing a sort of big gap between the cost of Russian oil and oil more generally. Now, if sanctions are brought to bear fully on Russian energy and Europe is looking elsewhere for energy, then costs are going to be incredibly high.
Yeah.
But let's see what happens.
Well, Sarah, on that point, we are just getting some headlines from Kadri Simpson, the EU Commissioner for Energy. She's saying that the EU is prepared for potential Russian oil supply shocks, and it's much better prepared for a gas crisis than a decade ago. So that's the story in Europe. And Sarah, I'm wondering, in your view, whether or not this crisis is going to create a larger divide between Europe and the ECB and the U.S. and the Federal Reserve.
I think it certainly is. I think if we go back just a couple of weeks, we were seeing the ECB pivoting to a more hawkish stance, indicating that QE tapering would be accelerated, that interest rates would be rising by the end of this year. Now, what we've seen subsequently, it looks to be a backpedaling on that. At the same time, Fed seems to be doubling down on rate hikes for later this month. So there does seem to be a clear divergence, and understandable. The impact on euro area growth, European growth more broadly, from the current crisis is going to be much more damaging than for the US, particularly given Europe's exposure to Russian energy provision.
Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah Kew in a Standard Chartered. Thanks for joining us. Now, sanctions are punishing Russia's wealthiest business people and the country's leader by bringing a cold, hard stop to 30 years of integration with the global economy. For more on our big take story, Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker joins us now. Stephanie, fascinating read. Fascinating to see the extent of the sanction being placed on the richest Russians right now, on oligarchs. Who's leading on this? I mean, many Western countries, many Western European and the US and some Asian countries in this too.
Yeah, the big surprise is that the European Union has really taken the lead at targeting the wealthiest Russians, having a much more aggressive approach than the UK, for instance, which is surprising because the UK has been such a magnet for Russian wealth since the 1990s, so much so that London has been nicknamed Londongrad. UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has said she's drawing up a hit list of Russian oligarchs, but we so far haven't seen additional oligarchs added to the list. And she has told members of parliament that she's received letters from their lawyers saying that they will challenge these actions. And I think that they're struggling to try to make sure that they do these sanctions in a way that's legally watertight. And that has been a struggle.
Stephanie, I think, first of all, it's an amazing piece. And I've already forwarded it to everyone I know because I think it's pretty comprehensive. I thought it was fascinating that yesterday we saw Abramovich say he's going to give his proceeds to victims of the war in Ukraine, and that Friedman and Avon, in your piece, you point out that they asked for the war to be stopped, but stopped short of criticizing Putin, and the same with Deripaska. So all of these oligarchs are saying, hey, we don't think this is a great war because they want to say it themselves, but they're not willing to go as far as to criticize Putin.
Absolutely. And, I do think that Mikhail Friedman and Peter Avon did go a bit farther by pointing the finger at Russia, saying Russia end this war, which is more of a direct criticism of Moscow than the other oligarchs. And so I would like to note that. But what you're seeing is that the sanctions are having an effect even on billionaires that have not been sanctioned, like Abramovich, who is already moving to offload assets because he worries about the day that sanctions do come and his bank accounts and all his assets are frozen. So even if the UK is not sanctioning them, he's moving. The concern, of course, is that they're offloading assets before the sanctions come, and that defeats the purpose of them.
Indeed, trying to get ahead of them, perhaps. Bloomberg, Stephanie Baker, thank you very much. More Bloomberg surveillance is ahead. This is Bloomberg.
U.S. has announced it's moving 8,500 more troops to Eastern Europe. If they're not being deployed to Ukraine specifically, why is that so important, and does that risk further provoking Russia?
Well, there's two things going on. So what the United States recently announced is that we are going to put 8,500 troops that are part of the NATO response force on high alert. That means they'll be ready to deploy on a moment's notice should we need those forces anywhere in Europe to protect NATO territory. In addition, the United States is also looking at possible additional moves that they might make to move U.S. force posture into Central and Eastern Europe. The reason we're looking at that is because a lot of the members in that neighborhood in Central and Eastern Europe feel concerned. And so we are looking at what measures we might take in the name of reassurance and deterrence.
There is a war going on, and the war is being conducted by one of the biggest oil powers in the world.
Energy is clearly overbought here, but it can remain overbought for weeks.
We are really thinking about risk management right now.
It's a question of how to control inflation without doing too much damage.
There's much more risk of the Fed doing too little than there is of the Fed doing too much.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
What a move in crude from New York City for our audience worldwide. Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Live on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Farrow. Futures down 0.2%. TK, the high of the session on Brent, 119.84.
You go out near 120 a barrel and you look at the real moves here, an inflation-adjusted move, John. Saudi Light, which is something I follow back to the 1960s, is a 3.3 standard deviation move on inflation-adjusted oil, on real oil. John, I've never seen that.
Chairman Powell, day two today, Tom. Your takeaway from yesterday and the look forward today.
He's traipsing forward, waiting for the data, and also buffeted by the politicians. The question here is Fed independence. I saw an independent chairman yesterday.
Got to work out the volatility flowing through this market as well. Lisa, looking at Russia, the financial walls are closing in day by day, inch by inch, day by day.
And we're seeing this both in name with respect to sanctions as also in practice. We've been talking about this all week, and I really was struck by how it's broadening out to even aluminum. I mean, every area of the commodity sector, people do not want supplies from Russia. At what point does this actually make a difference in bringing Russia to the negotiating table and bringing an end to this?
Just in the last 60 minutes alone, companies responding to this, Tom. Intesa, the bank out of Italy, its presence in Russia is under, quote, strategic review. Volkswagen stopping production in Russia, halting exports to Russia. Just company after company, right. Tom, that list is getting bigger and bigger.
Moments ago, John, I don't know if you've seen this, IKEA, I shop often, pauses operations in Russia and Belarus. To me, that has maybe more of a profound impact than you'd see out of, say, Volkswagen, because that is retail, and that is a people, the middle class of Russia, that have to react to what Mr. Putin has done.
That's the business issue, and then we've got the investment issue on top of that. Tom, people want to get out. They can't exit. They can't exit the trades because the market is still shut.
Yeah, and the MSCI, that was a bombshell announcement. I know Mike McKee forwarded the notes on that to me. You're absolutely right, John. And what's important here is these markets will clear, and we're watching the Bloomberg screen to see those dynamics. To me, the number one dynamic this morning is Euro-Swissy has not given up. We have persistent, strong Swiss franc this morning. That indicates more tension to come.
Let's pick up on the price action, Tom. Futures down 0.2% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq 100, down 0.4%. This Treasury market has been all over the place over the last couple of days, TK. 10's now down by 2 basis points to 185.42. On 2s, we're back at 150-ish, up 17 basis points, Tom, in yesterday's session alone.
Those ranges are wide, so I go to the ratios or the spreads, which is not a ratio, but we'll go with it. And the 2's10 spread is pretty much static. Yes, it's a little steeper than it was 24 hours ago, but John, those ratios are important. The real yield was a negative 1.00. It's a little better now, negative 0.88, but still, that's a lot of stress.
Lisa, euro dollar 110.86 for a fourth straight session, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, euro weakness.
And really the big question for a lot of people in markets is what's the off-ramp? How do we end this in near term? And that's what I am watching. Frankly, today, Ukraine may be holding a second round of talks with Russia on the border of Belarus and Poland as the devastation does continue. We are hearing from the Kremlin this morning that Ukraine negotiators are, quote, in no rush to come to talks. This is spokesman Dmitry Peskov of the Kremlin speaking in a conference call. How much can we see an exit strategy at a time when so many people are looking at this and saying, look, we've got a financial war on one hand and an actual war on one hand, and is there any winning in this situation? 10 a.m., we have day 2 of Fed Chair Jay Powell's testimony on Capitol Hill. John, you asked yesterday, what did we learn? The answer is, honestly, not that much, and yet markets seem to respond to it. He did say, I think that it is more than likely that we can achieve what we call a soft landing. They are far more common in our history than is generally understood. Of course, we also heard from a number of other Fed officials yesterday with somewhat contrary ideas. James Bullard of the St. Louis Fed coming out and say the situation calls for a rapid withdrawal of policy accommodation in order to preserve the best chance for a long and durable St. Louis durable expansion. And Chicago Fed President Charlie Evans said that basically this approach so far is wrong-footed. So how do we achieve that soft landing? And today we've got a slew of U.S. economic data. How much does it matter at a time when people are looking at a very quickly changing landscape? We get 8:30 a.m. initial jobless claims and February ISM services data at 10 a.m. We are looking at a market facing inflation with job openings at the fastest pace on record, almost 11 million job openings. John, what is the reaction function with CPI coming in at the hottest pace also in decades? Taking a look at the idea, are people going to come into the labor market more quickly in order to get enough money to sustain some of the levels of the pricing of goods?
CPI in America, 1 week away, payrolls this Friday. Lisa, thank you. Team coverage starts right now with Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo in Brussels, Aggie Cantrell in Poland on the border. Let's start with you, Maria. We heard from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, this morning. Your takeaway?
Well, you know, Jonathan, just to give you some color, by the way, when I was trying to watch this press conference, it was almost impossible. Why? Because the Russian channels and the Russian signal in Europe is now off the air. So finding this press conference, even on YouTube, was a real challenge. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, says that there is still a diplomatic solution here, that Russia is still willing to talk. But, Jonathan, I would be very careful here, because what Russia says is that they want to go into these talks with a number of conditions. That means, of course, that they talk about a new government in Ukraine. They say that Ukraine will have to give up weapons, and they also have to give up their bid for NATO and the EU. When I speak to Ukrainian officials here in Brussels, they say this is capitulation. This is not a negotiation, and they're not going to agree to this if that's what Russia continues to push for. What Ukraine wants today in this meeting, if it happens, it's not clear that it will. The Ukrainians are concerned still about locations. What they say is they want to talk about a ceasefire and humanitarian aid, nothing beyond that.
Aggie, let's talk about the humanitarian crisis emerging right now. The pictures coming out of Ukraine are deeply, deeply unsettling. Can you help us all understand the scale of what we're facing here?
Hi, John. Yes, so what we're seeing here on the border is a lot of people, a steady flow of refugees coming in every day, every hour from the Ukrainian side of the border. This is only a short drive from Lvov in usual times, but now we're seeing people waiting for days to try and cross this border. We're also seeing on the other side a lot of Polish people trying to help get humanitarian aid back into Ukraine. And this is also part of the discussion when it comes to the talks that Maria was discussing, is that we're talking about humanitarian corridors. The WHO has said there is an urgent need for humanitarian corridors to access places like Kiev, which are currently suffering from these attacks that aren't just targeting military spaces, but also civilian targets as well.
Aggie, Tom Keene in New York, thank you so much for being with us this morning. If a given tech company in America with, say, $200 billion on the balance sheet wanted to write $1 billion check this morning to help on the border, where would you think they would best spend that? What is the need right now of big American money?
I think it's difficult to say, Tom, where exactly the money would be best spent, except in the fact that here we're seeing a lot of different aid workers here. We're seeing a lot of the Red Cross. The UNHCR has done a massive campaign to try and get money into their institutions so that they can support people. The UNHCR obviously has a long-standing network, not only in Eastern Europe, but all over the world, and they're well-versed in dealing with this. I've been talking to people from the UNHCR on the ground here, and they're saying that they're expecting many, many more refugees to come through the borders in the coming weeks.
Maria, just quickly, do you get a sense from the European leaders you speak to that they believe that sanctions are working in trying to bring this to a close in the very near term?
Well, what they say is whether this war is coming to an end or not, it really depends on Vladimir Putin. And at this point, particularly my contacts that are Eastern Europeans, they say there is no point second guessing what he's going to do. Well, the only thing you can do is just prep for it. But in terms of are these sanctions working or not, the Europeans say yes, they are doing damage. We haven't seen the full impact, of course, because Russia is still shut for normal business. And just to give you just some color here, because this is also quite telling of the situation, the French government today has put out a letter about 40 minutes ago saying we have seized a mega yacht of 120 million euros that would now essentially belong to the French state until we figure out what to do with it. The Germans are also doing the same, and the Italians are looking to do the same. So they talk about real damage to the Russian economy, but also real damage to the oligarchs. Remember, these are people that for 10 years have really longed to belong to the upper echelons of European society, and today they're seeing their properties are being taken away at record time.
Maria, fantastic work, and to you, Aggie, just fantastic as well. Just brilliant from the whole team here at Bloomberg. Maria Tadeo and Aggie Cantrell there. Just on that yacht, Tom, of Igor Sechin, the CEO of oil company Rosneft, and of course the close ally of President Putin as well. As we understand it, the reporting led by Caroline Conan in France, Tom, this yacht was in the French Riviera in the shipyard for repairs. Then they got an understanding that perhaps that was going to make an emergency departure, and that's when they seized the boat.
You know, there's going to be a lot of that. I think, John, to Lisa's question, there's going to be massive follow-through on sanctions, and that's something that we all need to see. But, John, to me, the focal point seems to be, as you call it, Londongrad, and what the city and the lawyers will do. Stephanie Baker's important article for Bloomberg today highlighted that. John, what would you suggest is the next step for the city?
Well, Tom, I want to figure out how, let's say, Roman Abramovich of Chelsea actually sells the club, and who wants to buy it? Tom, can you imagine you've got an asset there for, let's say, 3 billion sterling, that's the price tag, and you want to sell it? Can you imagine being the buyer and trying to work out what would happen as you try and make that transaction? Does your money get trapped? Can you actually make that transaction cleanly over the next couple of days? Do you get trapped in by sanctions? What happens?
I would suggest that the people on the back end of the trade probably get what they want, but what happens to Mr. Abramovich is wide open, including the loans, John, that they have from Chelsea of Mr. Abramovich.
And I just want to pick up on the phrase they use, net proceeds, Tom, would go to charity.
Yes.
I mean, what are the net proceeds after the sale?
To me, that's the major question, the accounting of it all.
Who knows? Futures down 0.2 on the S&P, the Nasdaq down 1/3, a massive move in crude. WTI at 113, the high of the session for WTI crude, 116.57. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
Keep
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Rishika Gupta. The war in Ukraine has now entered its second week. Russian forces pressed ahead with their offensive. They fired missiles at the capital city, Kyiv, and they stepped up their campaign to take cities in the coastal south. More than 1 million refugees have fled to neighboring countries. Meanwhile, a second round of talks between Russia and Ukraine is set to take place today. And the price of oil soared to its highest level since 2008. West Texas Intermediate futures jumped 4% and approached $115 a barrel before falling back. Buyers continue to shun Russian crude since the invasion of Ukraine. And customs officials in France have seized a giant yacht owned by Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin. The seizure is part of European Union sanctions against Russia. According to French authorities, the yacht was docked near Marseille and was being prepared for an urgent departure. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell is making the fight against inflation his top priority over the risks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Powell testified before a House panel Wednesday and will appear before a Senate committee today. He said that he supports a quarter-point interest rate increase later this month. And the Congressional Committee investigating the attack on the Capitol now claims to have evidence that former President Trump may have committed a crime. That's according to a filing in federal court. The panel says that emails from Trump advisor John Eastman may contain evidence of an obstruction of an official proceeding. Eastman has sued to block the release of the emails. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
The Omicron variant and the latest wave have an impact on not only consumer trends, but your business. And do you expect the booster shots to make a difference?
Yeah, booster shot will make a huge difference. I think it's been accelerated by the huge leadership of the current Prime Minister Kishida. And I'm hopeful that our business will come back in Japan around perhaps mid-February to end of February, because we expect that a peak time will come around that time. And then the government will shift toward the reinvigoration of consumer. That will help us. And we had seen the huge comeback of the business in December when the things were toward the normalization. So I believe the business will come back, and I'm very much hopeful.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
Last month's jobs report caught everyone off guard.
A massive upside surprise.
Just an astounding number.
The most stunning miss I've ever seen.
This Friday, count on Tom, John, Lisa, and Mike to get you the numbers and analysis you need fast.
A labor market that looks increasingly tight.
The economy is shaking off this pandemic.
That's going to continue to keep the pressure on the Fed.
The February jobs report. Everything you need here on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Near-term effects on the U.S. economy of the invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing war, sanctions, and of events yet to come remain highly uncertain. Making appropriate monetary policy in this environment requires a recognition that the economy evolves in unexpected ways.
Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve, day one on Capitol Hill, day two later this morning. From New York City, good morning. Futures negative on the S&P, on the NASDAQ, on the S&P 500, trading lower by 0.1%, down 0.25% on the NASDAQ. The move we've seen in crude, just a monster move. WTI at 113. Brent earlier in the session came really close to 120. We've backed away since then. Close to 2008 highs, up around about 3% on the session at the moment. Yields come back in a couple of basis points after blasting high yesterday, 185.60 on 10s. And for a fourth straight session, Tom can't get away from it right now. Euro weakness, euro dollar, negative 0.4%, 110.78.
And very fragile. I'm glad you mentioned that, John. We're watching it tick by tick, folks. And you see a pulse. And John, I would suggest at 110.81, euro is resilient, but, and there's that whole thing going on.
This thing that Deutsche Bank picked up on, Tom, is brutal. This inverse correlation between what's happening with crude higher and euro weaker, that's vicious for the inflation story.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And, the dynamics here, we'll continue to bring it to you this morning across equities, bonds, currencies, and commodities. We're going to continue to monitor all in Ukraine, and particularly down by the Black Sea. But first, we must turn to what do you do given this war? Stephen Chivarone joins us, equity strategist and allocation manager at Federated Hermes. Steve, I think of a conservative house like you, and what do you do when you get a 3 standard deviation run on commodities? What do you do when oil spikes like this?
Well, I think there's two things you do. One is you try to understand what impact that has as part of a larger inflation on both equities and fixed income, right? Your traditional asset classes. And certainly the bind that it puts the Fed in. Everything that's going on in Europe is even more inflationary than what was in place before. And we've detailed, our concerns about that inflation for the last year on the show. In terms of the commodity itself, you've just got to look at the supply and demand, and it suggests that unless significant supply, starts coming on the market, prices continue to be biased higher on the energy.
Is this a place to use cash? I mean, Federated, I'm going to state as a general rule, has what I call prospectus cash, a little bit laying around. But how do you change a tone on cash given a global and certainly a regional crisis like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you assess the outlook, at least for the first half of this year, cash is an attractive asset class right here. It's certainly more attractive than longer duration fixed income, which is heavily pressured by rising inflation. And what appears to be a Fed that, even if they're not going to do 50 basis points in March, is going to be, well in a hiking cycle. And there's some chance or there's a good chance that equities will continue to be under pressure in the first half of the year from that rising discount rate. And so, yeah, we do find ourselves trimming fixed income and adding to cash above and beyond what we would normally hold in our portfolios.
Steve, yesterday we had Jay Powell speak, and the people were writing stories saying that because of his addressing inflation, we actually saw markets calm down and we saw markets revert to where they were before. Did he say anything newsworthy yesterday to justify that?
I mean, I think it depends on what you allowed yourself to believe coming in. We had entertained 50 basis points in March. It was never the consensus house call for us. It was generally 25, and we thought, that they would move in 25 basis point increments this year, somewhere between 5 and 7 times. I think that's still the base case, and I think he gave himself the out or freed the market of worrying about 50 in March. But I think he was also very clear to say that the Fed could revisit 50. They're in such a difficult spot right now. Go too fast, they risk stagflation or the pull forward of recession risk. Go too slow, and 7.5 and rising inflation can become entrenched. So it's a difficult time, I think, to be Fed chair.
Steve, a lot of people are talking about the possibility of a soft landing before the oil shock. At this point, do you think that the idea of a soft landing is pretty much off the table? And I say this knowing that you are building up cash.
So I wouldn't say it's off the table, Lisa. I'd say it's a shrinking landing strip. I think there is a scenario here where the Fed hikes, just right. Maybe that's 4 times, maybe that's 5 times. The way I've thought about it is, if we do 2% of hikes over the next 24 months, that's probably okay. It doesn't mean that a recession won't follow, but it's probably so far out in the offing that you're not worried about it in markets right now. If it's 2% in the next 12 months, well, then that's a very different story. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. So pace is going to matter, and incoming data is going to matter, and the response of inflation is going to matter.
Steve, awesome. As always, difficult time. I know. Steve Chevron there, Federated. Lisa, the growth outlook, I think that's something we need to focus on a little bit more here. Considering what's happening with the commodity market, crude at 113, Brent very close to 120. Is this the point when we need to start trimming the outlook for earnings, for GDP, and everything else?
And which nations will actually see the bigger hit? And a lot of people are pointing at Europe and saying it's going to take a much more material bite out of GDP there. In the United States, and here is where a lot of the uncertainty lies, it is such a strong economy. We're looking at unemployment rates at such a low pace. We're looking at raises, wage increases at a very fast pace and increasing. So at what point can we offset that? And at what point can't we?
If you're just tuning in, a couple of things happened overnight. MSCI and FTSE Russell both said they're cutting Russian equities from widely tracked benchmarks. Keep an eye on JP Morgan to see if they make the same decision on the debt side of the story. That's one to watch. And then just in the last 60 minutes, Tom, we've talked about this a couple of times already. 2 companies making the same move that we've seen from a whole range of companies over the last week. Volkswagen saying they're stopping production in Russia, halting exports to Russia. Intesa saying its presence in Russia is under, quote, strategic review. Tom, at the moment, it's company after company after company after company.
It's company after company. And what I would note yesterday in the wonderful conversation with David Folkers-Landau, John, he was heated about the fiscal stimulus we're going to see in Europe. This is a Europe unraveling government spending in support of Ukraine and to staunch Mr. Putin where he is. And I don't think it's a small item. He had the numbers on what the German government's going to spend, but it's a new fiscal regime in Europe.
Had a headline from the Washington Post moments ago too, Tom, that the president, according to the Washington Post, Lisa, asking Congress for $32.5 billion in Ukraine COVID aid.
Well, the Ukraine COVID aid, I'd like to dig in a little bit more in terms of how it would get allocated. But right now, what he's trying to tap is bipartisan feeling and, frankly, worldwide feeling of outrage of what's going on and empathy for the million or so refugees that have left Ukraine.
Lisa Bramage, Tom Keene and Jonathan Ferro guiding you through the morning to the opening bell 3 hours away. Futures are down 0.1% on the NASDAQ, down 0.2%. But what a rally we saw overnight in crude. WTI at 113.40 right now. The high of the session, 116.57. Brent came really close to 120, up 2.5% now. From New York City, this is Bloomberg.
this chip shortage is going to last longer than many people believe, likely straight through this year. And I wonder what that means for prices. Will this get worse before it gets better?
I don't know that it will get worse before it gets better, but there's no reason to believe it's going to get meaningfully better anytime soon. The Commerce Department put that data out yesterday, and what it showed is that there's a real shortage. Demand is 20% higher than it was a couple of years ago. There's a huge mismatch in supply and demand. Prices are high. Prices are higher. So what has to happen is we need to make more chips. Unfortunately, there's no easy solution. The solution is increased domestic manufacturing of chips, which is what we need to do.
Stocked early enough all these precious materials you were just mentioning, and we were on the lucky side that our prognosis was spot on in a way, forecasting what kind of material we would need and what quantity we would need.
Futures unchanged this morning, but we've been all over the place. On the S&P, we're pretty much dead flat. On the Nasdaq 100, down a little more than 0.1%. All over the place in the bond market. Switch on the board and get to treasuries. 2s, 10s and 30s. 2s down around about 9 basis points on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, up 17. Just like that. Chairman Powell building out the front end, Tom, and I think that's what we've got to talk about a little bit more. 149 down 2 basis points today, but I didn't hear a dovish Chairman Powell yesterday. I heard a Powell that's ready to do 25 basis points in a couple of weeks, then perhaps consider doing more if inflation keeps coming in hot. Would inflation come in hot on March 10th?
And the compare that short end to the long end, John, 34 basis points out to 36 basis points. That's barely a move, and that's a short, the sustaining of short higher yields.
That's the bond market. Let's talk about crude. At about 2:45 Eastern overnight, early this morning, 116.57. Higher this session for WTI. For Brent, we came really close to 120. We've backed away since then. Up on the session still, Tom, by 2.5% on WTI, 113 on Brent at 114.91, just short of 115. Up there by almost 2%. But what a move we've seen, Tom.
Yeah.
What did Amrita Sen of Energy Aspects say? Russian crude, about 70% of it can't find buyers right now. The consequences of that playing out in this commodity market.
And that goes to the demand destruction mystery, and truly, John, a mystery out there. We don't know. And, people trot out numbers, but I'm hearing 150, 170 given no demand destruction. What do you substitute to if you don't have oil?
Amrita said, Tom, demand's got to get hit. You've got to demand less of it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, weaker Swiss franc here right now. And dollar ruble is back over the last 24 hours at 107, but very emotional to say the least. On the American economy, with high-frequency economics, Rabia Faruqi working with Carl Weinberg, and it's wonderful to have her with us this morning. Rabia, a gallon of gas, I'm looking at AAA unleaded. We don't have a quote yet for this morning. It will be higher. What does a gallon of gas higher do to the American economy in your framework?
Good morning. Yeah, that's a very important question. And this is what we're trying to figure out, because we're seeing sustained gains in gasoline prices. We're seeing the effects of oil prices spilling over into, what consumers are going to be facing. And that has been, a concern. It's as households, allocate a larger portion of their budgets towards gasoline prices and towards food prices too. I think that's a concern. Consumer sentiment is already quite depressed, and on inflation concerns. And if we continue to see this move up, I think that's going to be a big factor on the demand side.
We saw IKEA moments ago say they will exit Belarus and Russia in some form, and that speaks to the middle class. I saw Target with bang up earnings. Now, I know that, analyzing Target is outside your remit, but what is the state of the middle class a year from now in America?
Yeah, and a lot of that depends on what happens, as events unfold. What are they looking at? Are they still looking at, higher gasoline prices, higher food prices? It is our expectation that these things are going to settle down, but there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding outcomes right now. So for now, we are still looking for positive momentum in the U.S. economy. We are looking at upside risks to inflation arising from the conflict, from higher oil and gas prices. But we do think that, once we get through this period of volatility, that things will settle down to a point where, it is more acceptable, that inflation will be at levels which will be more acceptable for households.
Rubila, what's the historical precedent that's most relevant to this moment?
I'm not sure that we have a relevant. I mean, we can look back to the 1970s. I don't think that this situation is really comparable. It is unique in that we are coming out of a pandemic and now we are going into another shock, which is the war in Ukraine. So I do think that the situation is unique. I think that there's a lot of things that we don't know in terms of linkages, in terms of, what happens with when Russia doesn't make payments, what happens with when it doesn't service its foreign debt, what are the linkages with Europe, and what are the implications for the U.S. economy? And I think that is also going to play into central bank decisions going forward.
Rubila, some theme that I've noticed through a number of different notes has been about employment and how all of those job openings will actually start getting filled as inflation goes higher, especially due to this shock, because people will need more income. Do you believe that? Do you think that that's what it will take to really tighten this labor market and see people actually come in, and that leads to lower wage increases down the line?
For now, what we're going to see is ongoing supply and demand imbalances. That is our base case, and that is going to lead to higher wages. Now, how long that persists, I don't think companies have the appetite. At some point, you reach that level of acceptance that, or you look at your profits and you look at your margins and you say, this is just not acceptable. We're going to look for alternate ways. I think companies are already doing that. But I think it's important that for now, we are going to see the imbalances. That's going to keep job growth going. But that also, rising wages should also be an incentive for some relief on the supply side. That is our base case. We expect that people will come back in. We will be looking at the participation rate when we get the data tomorrow. And hopefully we will see some relief on that.
Rubila, there's a small matter of a war, and we certainly don't make light of it. But the job is to guess the American economy. Do you agree with James Bullard of St. Louis that it may be more buoyant than anybody expects? We could get a run rate of 3% or indeed, dare I say, 4% real GDP?
We are definitely, the fundamentals right now are solid. There is absolutely nothing to suggest that the U.S. economy is looking at a very sharp, substantial slowdown below potential. Even when we, estimate growth in the second half of the year, we are estimating a growth rate that is close to 2.5%. So this economy has a lot of momentum. The biggest risk is that things can change very quickly, especially given the geopolitical backdrop. We don't really know what oil prices are going to do. We don't know what the supply side is, the disruption that can arise from that.
Rubila, completely unfair question, but you unfortunately have to speak to the great Carl Weinberg each and every day. He is truly expert and experienced in international debt workouts. How do you and Dr. Weinberg feel out of this war we will work out the debt structures of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and the new Iron Curtain?
Yeah, and I think he has been speaking to this quite a bit, and this is the fact that we don't really know what the implications are, how deep these connections go. And I think what comes out of it is that, countries either write down, principle, they either restructure debt. We don't have any indication of what the implications will be, how far-reaching they will be. But I do think, from Carl's perspective, from HFP's perspective, that this is probably going to be one of those situations where we're looking at that. And that has ramifications for financial markets in general.
Rubila, if you were on the Senate Banking Committee today, is there any particular question that you would really want to hear Jay Powell answer?
I think we are going to hear from Jay Powell exactly what he said yesterday, and I don't think he wants to offer anything more. And, I don't think the markets can really expect any more. He has been as clear as possible. He has laid out a path 25 basis points, a string of rate increases. And then, our base case is 3 rate hikes, and then they reassess. If inflation does not ease, and right now the indication is from oil prices is that the energy component is not going to ease, headline inflation is going to keep accelerating for now. If that is the case, then they're going to continue. But of course, the employment backdrop, where the economy is, how much demand destruction we actually see from this, those are important components. But I don't think he can be any clearer. I think, he's done, it was very surprising to see that, he actually laid out a 25 basis point rate hike. He's taken all the uncertainty. He's made sure that the Fed is not a source of distress in the markets.
Rubila, great to catch up. I was surprised by that too. Made a call for March 16th already before the meeting. Rubila Faruqi of High Frequency Economics. Mike Gapin of Barclays making a call too. Just put in his estimate for inflation, Tom, for next week, 7.9%. is his call.
Yeah, well, John, 7.9% is not 8%. Can you imagine the institutional reaction to an 8% statistic? We heard that. We heard the tension there from Lawrence Summers yesterday.
The estimate I see from Morgan Stanley right now, and of course this can change ahead of next week, has an 8 handle. It's at 8%. Now, Citi changed their call on the Fed for 2 weeks' time, Tom. They dropped the 50 basis points, but they've just chucked it out to May. They say this: we now expect a 25 basis point hike on the 16th as opposed to our previous base case of 50. Our base case now includes a 50 basis point hike in May instead. This inflation story, Tom, it's getting sticky.
And this is really important. The media, folks, really spends a lot of time on magnitude and the parlor game of 7.9, 8, 6 point, whatever, blah, blah, blah. John, I'm looking at the x-axis, the timeline here, and it is radically extended out where we have an inflation impulse out further.
So this comes on March 10th, and I said this earlier this week. Later economists will come on, market strategists will too, and say it's one data point, it doesn't change the world. If you get on March 10th an 8th handle, do you think that changes the conversation for Chairman Powell going into that meeting?
I would think it would have to, but he's already aware of this, right? I mean, he basically is conceding that there is going to be incredibly quick inflation and that he has to get ahead of this. What's he going to do, especially because what you're seeing in the bond market is not the idea that this is going to be a soft landing or be productive for economic growth. It is quite the opposite.
Well, he's come in and told us what he's going to do already, 25 basis points.
It's true. He's not going to go 50.
Then the next line, to the extent that inflation comes in higher or is more persistently high than that, then we would be prepared to move more aggressively by raising the Fed funds rate by more than 25 at a meeting or meetings.
Should we be talking about May 4th? What is the distance now, John, given these horrific events, this horrific war? What is the, I'm sorry, but maybe I'm more interested in May 4th than I am March 16th
I think at the moment, Tom, 2 weeks feels like a lifetime away, considering what's playing out in Ukraine, never mind May. Futures down 0.2% on the S&P, and the Nasdaq down around about 1/3. We back away from session highs on crude, 113.82. On Brent, really close to 120 overnight, backing away there as well. In the bond market, yields down 2 basis points. Your yield on 10s, 185.40. This is Bloomberg.
Keeping you up to date with news from around the world with the first word, I'm Ritika Gupta. President Biden is trying to pressure Vladimir Putin over the invasion of Ukraine by sanctioning Russian banks and oligarchs. At the same time, the U.S. is signaling it doesn't want the crisis to spiral out of control with provocative acts. It postponed a missile test scheduled for this week. The administration has also refrained from discussing regime change in Moscow. The price of wheat is continuing its meteoric rise. It soared past $11 a bushel to the highest level since 2008. Prices are up some 50% in the last month. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought shipments from one of the world's biggest growing areas to a virtual standstill. And a new study underscores the potential danger of lifting pandemic curbs too quickly. Japanese scientists say that the Omicron strain of the coronavirus is at least 40% more lethal than seasonal flu. Omicron's fatality rate is still much lower than the fatality rate seen earlier in the outbreak. Researchers say that could reflect the benefits of the vaccination. And in Japan, former Nissan director Greg Kelly was found guilty of helping Carlos Ghosn underreport his compensation. A court in Tokyo gave the American executive a 6-month suspended sentence. Ghosn and Kelly were arrested the same day back in November 2018, but Ghosn made a spectacular escape from Japan in a private jet. And Tesla CEO Elon Musk is challenging the United Auto Workers Union to hold a vote at his California factory. Musk says that Tesla will do nothing to stop union organizers. Musk's challenge came after President Biden again failed to mention Tesla while promoting EVs in his State of the Union address. The president is a big supporter of labor unions. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
What do you think is the impact of the Prime Minister on the market?
As Mr. Suzuki, who is the Financial Services Minister, he mentioned at his own press conference, and share buybacks is widely used to return profits to shareholders and improve ROE. And how to share out the profits from growth is, totally the decision of the management of each company after carefully taking, all the stakeholders into consideration. And I believe Mr. Kishida has a quite cautious stance on the uniform regulation of share buybacks. And I think because he is giving a consideration to each company's, individual circumstance and, decisions.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
As a company grows, there are more challenges. What do you worry about the most?
The market opportunity for us is enormous, and so our challenge is to continue innovating, driving, and pushing ourselves every single day to go after the most attractive profit pools in this incredible global beauty and wellness market.
Wherever you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
Hasn't been decided yet what would happen if
the Russians withdrew. We see no signs, unfortunately, that the Russians have any intention of withdrawing right now. And indeed, their military operations in Ukraine continue to escalate.
That was Ron Klain, the White House Chief of Staff. From New York this Thursday morning, good morning. Futures negative on the S&P, down by a third, down by 0.4 on the NASDAQ 100. What a move in crude. 113.18 on WTI, up by more than 2.3%. The high of the session, 116.57. Tom, we just back away from that a bit, but overnight, seemingly on our way to 120 on Brent at one point.
Yeah, I think it waits for news on military action within Ukraine, folks. We're trying to be very careful about attribution here, but certainly down in the Black Sea, it has been an exceptionally ugly 48 hours. Talk of boats off of Odessa, and we'll have to see how that unravels this morning. But any kind of continued war news there in the sanctions story will move commodities, and not just oil. There's some huge moves outside of the most visible oil economy. This is our most important conversation today on your underlying theories and beliefs of international relations, foreign affairs, and this war. Tina Fordham has been kind to join us numerous times, head of global political strategy at Evanhurst, and we're thrilled she could be with us this morning. Tina, the theory is, and I did a couple interviews with John Mearsheimer, and I did one private thing with Dr. Kissinger as well, of realpolitik. You are adamant and heated no. What do Mearsheimer, Dr. Kissinger, and the others, what do they miss?
Well, I think they miss the role of human agency. And so also do, for example, the super forecasting types. They could maybe predict when something would happen and that it would just be accepted. Of course, I'm being a little bit provocative when I criticize Dr. Kissinger, whom I've met several times and have enormous respect for, but the realpolitik theory, the realist theory of international affairs says that we should grant Putin his security buffer, even if that means a country of 44 million people have to be subjugated by violence. And that's the extension of it. And I think people are voting with their feet in various ways to say, no, they don't want this. And when Putin uses the word genocide, I think he's going to find that comes back at him in unexpected ways.
The map of Ukraine developing from the 17th century is a move westward, including into 1945 in parts of Poland. Do you perceive that Mr. Putin wants all of Ukraine? Does he stop at the river, or does he stop partway to Lviv?
Well, I know my Russian Empire and Soviet history. I studied at the Harriman Institute at Columbia, and I never thought it would be as useful as it is to me. But I think we have to be really careful when we try to parse the kind of ashes of empire and extrapolate them to what current borders should mean. I mentioned before the incredible comments from the Kenyan ambassador to the UN, who said, listen, we in Africa all live in countries with artificial borders. We all live with people we might not choose to be with, because that's the way that borders were drawn. But we're not going to go back and start redrawing borders. That's why I think our kind of narrow understanding of history constrains us in appreciating this crisis. Ukraine is not the only country that has people who speak different languages.
Yeah, but how are we redrawing the strategic playbook when we're using financial weaponry rather than artillery and military weaponry in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? How much does this actually prove to be a useful tool versus two different ones that move past each other and just wreak havoc on both sides?
Lisa, we're about to find out. I mean, the scale of the sanctions and the pace of implementation has been staggering. I think that, Putin observed the kind of minor, tame response to the 2008 war in Georgia, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and, thought that the penalty would be something that he could live with. He's continued to say that the sanctions don't matter. Well, they're certainly mattering to everyday Russians who have lived through various crises where the value of the ruble has crashed. They certainly know how to live in this environment, but these aren't smart sanctions. These are pretty blunt.
But what's the off-ramp? And as I hear you talk and as I hear about popular discomfort in Russia, does it even matter for Vladimir Putin, who has spent years stifling his opponents? Anyone who comes out vocally against him, it manages to disappear. So how do we then translate that into an off-ramp that will end this conflict?
Well, Putin has shown zero interest in our off-ramps. Let's be clear. He's been offered many. He was meant to have talks with President Biden the week he invaded Ukraine and told us he wasn't going to do it. So on some level, you're talking about how to make it easier for a bully, an international bully, not to do something that he seems intent on doing. I think maybe another question might be, what are the countervailing forces that either might persuade him to change his mind or increase the domestic costs? And that's where the biggest mass protests ever in Russia post-perestroika in 10 Russian cities really matter. There is domestic pushback, and these people are getting arrested for taking flowers to the Ukrainian embassy in Moscow.
Tina, wonderful to get your